Good evening, everyone. I'm going to give an update on COVID-19, and this is for the Nepali American Organization of Ohio. I don't have any associations with any companies that are involved with COVID-19, diagnosis, treatment, vaccines, nothing. I will speak about the history of COVID-19, talk about the epidemiology, describe the virus, talk about the clinical features, the tests that are available, the different transmission modes, the treatments and vaccines. And I'll try to cover all this very briefly. This is just to give you an overview of all the pandemics that have happened over the last 100 years. In 1918, there was a Spanish flu, and that was a very severe, there were approximately 50 million deaths, which is more than 2.5% of the entire world population. The next big pandemic was in 1957. That was the Asian flu pandemic. There were about 1.5 million deaths. Then in 1968 was the Hong Kong flu, and there were about 1 million deaths with that. After that, the next pandemic was something that many of you will remember. That was in 2009. That was the novel H1N1 influenza pandemic. Now you'll see that all these pandemics were influenza viruses. Then in end of 2019, we had the first pandemic that was not an influenza pandemic, and that was the coronavirus pandemic. So now coronaviruses are not new. We've had coronaviruses for a while. There are four different types of coronaviruses that have been circulating. They cause common colds, coughs, mild illnesses, and those are the four that I've listed here. Then in the last 20 years or so, we've had three different coronaviruses that have gone on to cause epidemics or pandemics. Some of you might remember in 2003, there was a pretty big epidemic that was called severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, that was caused by a coronavirus. That coronavirus was given the name SARS coronavirus. That was a severe illness where of all the people who were infected, about 10% died. So the case fatality rate was 10% for the SARS epidemic. Altogether, there were about 8,098 people infected over in between 15 and 20 countries. And then it mysteriously died out by about 2004. No one really knows exactly why it just disappeared. In 2012, another coronavirus emerged in Saudi Arabia, and that was called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. That was the virus was given the name MERS coronavirus. That was a pretty severe illness with a case fatality rate of 35%. It is still active, but it hasn't really spread like the prior coronavirus. There have been over 2,500 people infected, and all of them pretty much have had some sort of association with the Middle East, mainly with Saudi Arabia. So most of the cases have been confined to Saudi Arabia. There was a bit of an epidemic in South Korea. In the United States, we had only two people who got infected with MERS coronavirus. Then 2019 was the COVID-19 that was very similar to the prior SARS coronavirus of 2003. So it was called SARS coronavirus 2. This one has been a milder illness overall. The case fatality rate has been about 2%. But when we've had over 65 million people who've been infected, that's still a large number of deaths. And this is the first one that's been a pandemic of the coronaviruses. So this gives a brief timeline of this pandemic. November 17th was the date when the first case was noted in Wuhan province, China. Of course, at that time it was pretty much kept a secret. And it was only on December 31st, at the end of the year, that China first reported the illness. By January 7th, the Chinese had identified that this was caused by a new coronavirus. By January 14th, the first case was reported outside China. This was in Thailand. January 21st, the first case was reported in the United States. And by March 11th, when the World Health Organization declared this to be a pandemic, there were cases in 110 countries. By the 1st of May, we had the first medicine that was approved for the treatment, and that was remdesivir. And by December 5th was the first vaccine approved by the UK. The United States is very close. Within this coming week, we expect one of the vaccines to be approved. So this just gives a number of case counts over some of the countries in the world. Over 65 million worldwide, 14 million in the United States. And you can see that there are almost 10 million in India, and in Nepal, more than 250,000 cases so far. This just gives the trend of new cases, and the green line, unfortunately, is the United States. So we can see that there are large numbers, and the numbers are really going up. This is the average daily cases, and this is based on the last 7 days. So you can see that in March, we had a end of March, early April, we had the first wave, and then after in July, we had the second wave, and then we are now having the third wave, and this is clearly much worse than the other ones. If you look at some of the most affected countries, this shows the 9 most affected countries. United States, you can see this is Brazil. India, the numbers seem to be going down, but again, Turkey, it's gone way up. Russia, most of the countries, the numbers are going up. These are numbers from the CDC. The numbers are a little higher than what we get from the World Health Organization, but you can see that there are over 14 million cases and almost 300,000 deaths. This is just an example of what's going on in hospitals. These are data from the Cleveland Clinic Health System. And again, just mirroring the numbers of cases, we had a bit of a sustained peak in March, April, May, and then a bit in July. And then now, this is the new peak with the numbers of cases in the different hospitals in the Cleveland Clinic Health System. So clearly, many, many, many more cases than before. This picture shows you the structure of the SARS coronavirus. And this is the reason this is called coronavirus is that the word corona in Latin means crown. And so this one, to someone at least, looked like a crown. And so this shows different spike proteins. And these are the proteins on the surface. This is the S is a spike protein. There's an E protein, and this is the M protein. So these are 3 proteins on the surface of the virus. This picture just gives a cross section of the virus. So this is what the virus looks like. It's a spherical virus. On the outer surface, the outside is the covering of the virus, and on the inside is the nucleic acid core. This is the most important part of the virus because this contains the genetic information that that allows the virus to replicate, and that also allows the virus to produce the proteins that it needs. So these are some of the symptoms. It's just like any influenza-like illness. So mainly fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath. This is a respiratory illness, and so shortness of breath or difficulty breathing is a common symptom. Someone can feel very, very tired. We can have muscle or body aches. So these are very, very, very similar to anyone who might have the flu. People might have a headache. A very prominent symptom is loss of taste or loss of smell. Now, these are not very common symptoms in most illnesses. Mainly, you'd have some sort of a neurological illness where you'd have loss of taste or smell. So if someone has a flu-like illness, but they have a loss of taste or sense or smell, that is very, very suggestive of COVID-19. And so there might be other symptoms too. So this is so the question is, what is the incubation period? When you get exposed to the COVID-19 virus, how long is it before someone becomes ill? And when people have looked at this, the median incubation period is about 5 days. So after people are exposed, about half the people will develop symptoms by 5 days. Of the people who are going to develop symptoms, half of them will develop symptoms by 5 days. 5% develop symptoms within a couple of days. And 95% of people, if they're going to develop symptoms, that's going to happen by 14 days. But the median is about 5 days. So now we'll come to the tests for COVID-19. There are different types of tests. So they can be categorized into 2 groups. One is doing some tests to look for the presence of the virus. And that is called, there are 2 types of tests. One is the nucleic acid amplification test. And that test is to amplify the nucleic acid in the inside of the virus. The other is antigen tests. These are just tests that look for parts of the virus circulating in the body. Now, the nucleic acid amplification tests are more complex tests. They take longer. They are more sensitive because it involves an amplification step. The antigen tests are less expensive tests. They can be done more quickly. But if someone does not have a lot of the virus, those tests can be falsely negative. The second type of test is called are the antibody tests. So these tests do not look for the presence of the virus. What they look for is the presence of antibodies that are produced by the body against the virus. So it's an indirect test. It just indirectly says that the body encountered this particular virus, so it produced antibodies against that. These are less specific because if the body has previously seen some other coronavirus, it might produce antibodies that are somewhat similar to what the COVID-19 virus would produce. And of course, the other thing is that these antibody tests will not show up early. It'll be some time before antibodies are produced. This picture just gives you an idea of comparing what the SARS-CoV coronavirus 2 viral shedding looks like and what the original SARS in 2003. And so what you can see, if you look at 2003, that was the first SARS coronavirus. The virus was really shed not at the time of when people started developing symptoms. There was very little, but then we started having virus shedding a few days after people started having symptoms. In contrast with SARS coronavirus 2, people start producing a lot of virus well before they start, actually a little before they start having symptoms, 1 or 2 days before that. And so the why this becomes important is in the case of SARS, the original SARS infection, people were not contagious before they had symptoms. And so it was much easier to identify who had symptoms and to take precautions. In the case of SARS coronavirus 2, people are actually infectious even before they start developing symptoms. So it's very difficult to control a disease like this. This is just early in the pandemic. We wanted to see how much virus someone has during the course of the illness. And so this is one of the things that we checked at the Cleveland Clinic because we had important questions about how long do you need to keep people away from work. And so this just shows you that at different days since the onset of illness, the amount of virus can be very, very variable, large numbers, but you can see that the amount of virus actually drops down quite quickly. This is from the same data set, and we have each line represents an individual patient. So what this shows is that in almost all patients, the virus actually starts going down pretty quickly. There are few outliers of where the virus goes up. An important thing is, although this looks like a lot over here, once we get down to this range here, the amount of virus is actually very little. And so anyone with a quantity of virus below this bold red line, they probably do not have enough to spread the virus. And the dotted red line shows an even lower quantity, and anyone who has virus less than this would probably have negative antigen tests. And so that's why there could be a lot of confusion when you have positive and negative tests. The other thing is also when you have virus that's down, when you have the quantity of virus is very low, as in this range over here, even these PCR tests that are done, which are the best tests, they could sometimes be positive, they could sometimes be negative because the amount of virus is so small. So it really depends on the quality of the sample that they get. So if they get a good sample, you might detect the virus, whereas in the same patient, if you get a quality sample that is not all that good, you might actually have a negative test. And that's why there's a lot of confusion about people saying that, I had a negative test and then I had a positive test. Because one of the things we know is that once you are infected, you could actually have virus for a few weeks. And so it's possible that even after you feel well, if you are tested, you may still continue to have a positive test for some time. So that brings us to transmission. How is this virus transmitted? So the major mode of transmission is what's called droplet transmission. That's when people are speaking, coughing, sneezing, etc. Little droplets go out. They contain the virus and they land on other structures, and that's the major mode of transmission. There has been a lot of controversy about whether there's what's called airborne transmission, which means the virus is suspended in the air and travels great distances. If there's probably some airborne transmission with this virus, but it is clearly a very minor route of transmission. The other forms of transmission are really irrelevant here. Now, of course, the risk of transmission really depends on how much virus there is present in the infected case. It also depends on the circumstances of exposure. It means how close the exposed person was to the infected person and for how long. And also depends on the immune status of the exposed person. So if the exposed person is in pretty good health, then a small amount of virus may not cause that person to become ill. Whereas if the exposed person was already in poor health, then a small amount of virus may actually cause illness. So it depends on a number of factors. The most important of these, of course, is the viral load, which means how much virus there is. This was a study done very early in the pandemic. They looked at 9 cases in Germany. And what they found is still, although it's a very small number of cases, it's still very relevant because all studies are pretty consistent with this. So just like our study that we did at the Cleveland Clinic, they also noticed a rapid decline in the viral load over a few days. So the y-axis is on a logarithmic scale. So this drop that you see is actually much, much more than what it looks like over here. The other important thing that they also showed is that they look for the virus by doing PCRs, which amplifies the nucleic acid material. Now we know that PCR can amplify living as well as dead virus. And so what they did is also they cultured the virus to see what they would get. And what they found is that they were not able to culture the virus in any patient after 8 days of illness, even when they had positive PCR tests. So you can see these positive culture results. After 8 days, none of these were positive by culture, although they were positive by PCR. And then the other thing was also that the cultures were only positive when the viral load was very high. So you can look at the copies per ml, and log 6 means more than 1,000 copies per ml. It's only when virus was more than that quantity that they could culture the virus. Less than that, although they were positive by PCR, they could not culture the virus in any of those. And so what the study tells us that is that they were only able to culture the virus when the amount of virus was very high. Now, of course, some people would look at this and say, well, that means that anything less than that is dead virus. And that's actually not very true. But it's certainly the case that when there's less virus, the likelihood of transmission is low. So this is data that we modeled because we wanted to try look at the mode of transmission, the risk of transmission over time. And based on a modeling, what we found is that the viral load really peaks within 2 or 3 days of the onset of symptoms. 0 is the date of onset of symptoms, and it drops rapidly thereafter. So within 2 or 3 days, the viral load has already peaked, and then by 7 days, the viral load is much, 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 much lower. So if you look at the area under the curve, 97% of this is within 7 days. And so based on this, we can say that most of the transmission potential is definitely within 7 days of onset of illness. And beyond 10 days, the risk of transmission is really minimal. Now, this is, of course, based on people who became ill but did not require hospitalization. If you look at the same thing for people who are hospitalized, this extends out by maybe about 2 days, but it's the same trend, but it just follows about 2 days later. And so by 7 to 10 days after the onset of symptoms, the risk of transmission is really very small. Now, this is also supported by another study where they actually looked at cases of COVID-19 and then they looked at controls to see how much transmission occurred. So they looked at 100 confirmed patients and almost 3,000 of their close contacts. And what they found is that, of course, the rate of transmission, what I will say is other than the studies in household contacts, about half of people ultimately would get infected in close household contacts. But again, the time of in the exposed people, the time to transmission, most of it was within about 3 to 4 days. So you can see that in the close household contacts, household family contacts, the highest transmission was about 3 days from the date of exposure. So this is a nice picture that we talk about infectious droplets and what we call droplet nuclei, which are responsible for airborne transmission. And this is just a nice picture which shows that. So when you cough or sneeze or exhale, these the body generates different sizes of these fluid particles suspended in the air. The largest ones are called, they're the largest droplets. They fall down within 1 to 3 feet. Smaller droplets fall down within 3 to 5 feet. And beyond that, there are things that those that are really small, what happens is that if there are viral particles in those, they dry out and then the virus just remains suspended in the air and that can travel long distances. But also what you have to remember is that the amount of virus in each of these particles depends on how big that particle is. So if it's a bigger particle, there's going to be more virus. If there's smaller particles, there's going to be less virus to begin with. And so most of the infectious particles are going to be these larger and these smaller infectious droplets, which is why the 6 feet, that is the idea. Most of these droplets are going to fall within the 6 feet. Now, if you talk about things like influenza, maintaining about the 3 feet distance is good because most of the infectious particles are these larger droplets. But in this case, 6 feet is to account for some of these smaller infectious droplets smaller particles also being infectious. If someone has a very, very high viral load, then even these smallest particles might contain enough virus to go and spread the infection to another person. But if the viral load is small, then it's very likely that when you have these really small particles, it's very unlikely that there's any virus in these really tiny particles. Of course, that's normal speaking and other things, but when you cough or sneeze, then you can expel particles quite a distance. And this just gives you an example. And you can actually, you can send large or small droplets as far as 9 meters when you cough or sneeze, which is why it's so important to cough or sneeze into your arm. Just don't cough or sneeze out. And this is another reason why if people wear masks, it really protects a lot, because if someone is infected and they don't know it, but when they're speaking, they're coughing, a simple mask just protects other people from all this stuff here. So now there are often many questions related to isolation, quarantine, return to work. And so you can understand. So, if anyone asks me, I would answer, but you can pretty much look at these two graphs over here and come up with a pretty good idea about what to do in all these different settings. So the first graph shows the incubation period. So what that tells you is that people who have been exposed, by 5 days, half of them are going to develop symptoms. Sorry, this should be 14 days here. Sorry. And by 14 days, 95% of the people who've been exposed, they develop. So if someone has not developed symptoms by 14 days after they've been exposed, they almost certainly did not get the infection. Half the cases you can say by 5 days. This other one just gives you an idea about the viral load dynamics. So this is about how much virus you have once you're infected. So for someone who develops symptoms, by about 7 days after the onset of symptoms, the amount of virus is really, really little. By about 10 days, it's almost negligible. And so if you keep these two in mind, if you see how long is someone going to be infectious, and so the answer is that, if someone's infectious, within 5 to 7 days, they're really not going to be infectious. When should you test someone? If you suspect you've gotten exposed, when should you test? Like you say, um, by about 2 days, 5% of people have symptoms. By about 5 days, half the people have symptoms. So if you really want to be tested, you've got exposed, you don't have symptoms, but you really want to be tested, I would say you wait about a week before you get tested, because by that time you develop symptoms, and we know that even 1 or 2 days before the onset of symptoms, you might have detectable virus. So if you wait about 7 days, you've not developed symptoms, you'll probably pick up the majority of patients who've gotten infected. Question about return to work. And yes, so there are CDC guidelines, but the answer again is just based on something like this. By 7 to 10 days after the onset of symptoms, the risk of transmission is really small. So if you feel well enough, you could certainly go back to work at 10 days, and that's what the CDC recommends. Similarly, how long should infected patients be isolated and exposed persons quarantined? It's again the same idea. If someone has been exposed, give them about 5 to 7 days to start declaring symptoms. So if they're quarantined for a week, if they're quarantined for 14 days, you can be pretty sure that's really the safest thing to do. In some cases, they're going to ask people to be quarantined for less time, and in those cases, yes, it's possible you might be missing a few of the cases who might show up late. But if people are essential workers, then you'd mitigated most of the risk by waiting about 10 days. And so that's why you'll see some of those recommendations which might be a little different from place to place. And so this again is the return to work guidance for CDC, and they say at least 10 days have passed since the symptoms first appeared. And for people who have had severe to critical illness, they've said at least 10 days and up to 20 days have passed since symptoms appeared. What I will tell you is that if someone goes on to develop severe to critical illness, that does not happen in the first week. That typically happens the second week. So by the time they've recovered from their severe critical illness, it's already 20 days. So there's really no issue here with either of these recommendations. So when we test for COVID-19, these are some points that it'll be nice to keep in mind. So the blue line over here just shows the amount of virus, and consistent with every study that we've done, you can see that from the time of the onset of symptoms, even within a day or two before that, you can start detecting the virus, and it peaks within 2 or 3 days and then drops rapidly. And by second week or so, you're not going to be able to detect the virus. Antibodies only start showing up later. They start showing up in the second week, and then it's really by the third to fourth week that you start seeing antibodies. So if you do a nucleic acid amplification or an antigen test, it's going to be if it's that's going to work 1 or 2 days before the onset of symptoms, maybe up to a week or two. What I will say is that the PCR tests could actually remain positive for a long time. Once it's positive, they could remain positive for 3 or 4 weeks. But the antibody test, if you do an antibody test in the first 1 week or maybe in the first 2 weeks, most of those tests are going to be negative. So we really don't use antibody tests. They are cheap, they're inexpensive, but we don't use them to diagnose COVID 19. The most important test is really the nucleic acid amplification test, but a much less expensive one is the antigen test. If someone is within 3 or 4 days of the onset of symptoms, you could easily do an antigen test and it'll be positive. If it's negative, it's not COVID 19. Now, for treatments, many treatments have been tried. There's been a lot of nonsense regarding this, and all these are treatments that these have not been shown to be effective. In some cases, like hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, they've actually even been shown to be harmful. But all of these tests, they have been used at some time or the other. They've also been widely, so they've been widely um, advertised by different people. Things like tocilizumab, convalescent plasma, some people are still using these. Unfortunately, because of all the drama that went around these were never studied properly. So unfortunately, I don't know that we'll ever find out whether these were truly effective or not. Tocilizumab, very few people still use that. It's an interleukin 6 inhibitor. Convalescent plasma, there are a number of people who still use that. There are many people who've stopped using it. But unfortunately, because these were never studied properly, we don't really know if they work. The treatments that have been shown to be effective, the only antiviral medication that has been shown to be effective is remdesivir. And other than that, steroids have been shown to be useful, especially dexamethasone is what was used in the clinical trials. And if dexamethasone is effective, prednisone is also going to be effective. So the steroids are really the most important in my mind. Recently, monoclonal antibodies have also been shown to be effective. These are expensive medications, but I really don't know their utility just because of the nature of what they do, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So when we talk about, so that's why when you come to what we have to think about when you're considering treating someone, these are the different concepts that you want to keep in mind. Of course, the first thing is the viral load dynamics. So if you don't have virus, no antiviral is going to be effective. And so we know that by a week or 10 days after the onset of symptoms, the amount of virus in the body is very low. So it just makes no sense to give someone an antiviral medication after about a week of the onset of symptoms, because if there's no virus, an antiviral medication is not going to be effective. And that's why over the course of the disease course, remdesivir, it's really going to be useful within the first week of illness. After that, yes, if someone ends up in the hospital, they're sick, everyone gives them remdesivir, but it makes no sense because there's no virus at that time. When people are ill, the first week of illness is when they have the virus, the body is responding to that. By the end of the first week, the virus is gone. Now people are ill not because of the virus, but because of the body's response to the virus, because of everything that the body has done to try to attack the virus. Those inflammatory processes continue and they cause a lot of damage. And so in the second week of illness, the steroids is what really matters. Now, most people are ill within the first week. If they become severely ill, it happens in the second week of illness. So most of that is not really because of the virus, it's because of inflammation. And that's why in clinical studies, steroids have consistently been shown to be effective during the stage. Monoclonal antibodies are really antibodies that is just like what the body would have produced in the ideal state against the virus. So these are specifically produced antibodies, and if they're going to be effective, of course, they would be effective early in the course of illness before severe illness has happened. And so theoretically, they should be effective again in the first week, maybe in the second week of illness. But the problem is that of all the people who develop COVID 19, 85% of people go on to have a mild illness. It's only 10 to 15% to go on to have severe illness. These are expensive medications to give to everyone to try to prevent that in the 10-15% of people who become ill. And if you wait until they become ill, then it's very questionable whether they are effective at all. So that's why it's very hard to understand what to do with these monoclonal antibodies. They're expensive medications. There are companies that have produced this medication. They've already got some treatment from the government, but and I know at least the first one that is approved, the bamlanivimab, the company is not even going to do phase 3 studies because they don't think that it has a future. So the basic point of all this is that remdesivir in the first week and steroids in the second week is the mainstay of treatment. So coming to vaccines, which is what I think most of you are interested in hearing about. So there are over 200 COVID-19 vaccines that are being studied. There are very few that have advanced to the stage 3, towards the end of stage 3 study. So these are the five vaccines that are most advanced. The most well-known ones, the ones that have got most publicity, are the messenger RNA vaccines. These are a new type of vaccine. And the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, these are the two that are very close to being approved, are both messenger RNA vaccines. Both of them require two doses to be given. So these are not single dose vaccines, they're two-dose vaccines. The biggest limitation of these is that they need to be stored at these really low temperatures. So the messenger RNA, these are not very stable these are not very stable compounds, so they get degraded very easily. So they have to be protected by a covering, which is what these companies have produced. And the covering is really proprietary, so of course we don't know what they are, but that's what they've produced to protect the viruses. Now those, to protect all that, this vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, has to be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius. The Moderna people, they think they have the better thing that's more stable, and so but that vaccine too has to be stored at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Other than these, the other vaccine is the Oxford or AstraZeneca vaccine. This is a different type of vaccine. It's an adenovirus vector vaccine. So this is the more traditional one. There are previously many other vaccines have been produced using this technology. So now this adenovirus is actually a virus which causes an infection, but this is a virus which does not cause a problem. It can cause an infection, but does not cause a problem. And so they put the nucleic acid of this virus into this adenovirus vector, and then they inject this, and the body produces antibodies against the virus. It cannot cause, so this designed so that it does not cause disease, but the body is able to produce antibodies. So that's the idea of the adenovirus vector vaccines. Recombinant vaccines, these are vaccines which are, they just, they take not the whole virus, but parts of the virus which are antigenic. So let's say the spike protein or some of the other proteins that are on the surface. They inject those, the body sees those produces antibodies against those. And then later, if the real virus gets in, then those antibodies fight against that. The Sputnik vaccine that you might have heard about in Russia, that's also an adenovirus vector vaccine. The two vaccines in China, the Sinovac, the Sinopharm vaccines, those are actually different. Those are not these types. That's a fourth type of vaccine called an inactivated vaccine. So it's not killed virus, because a killed virus is not going to work. It has to be living somehow, that it gets into the body and starts multiplying. But it's an inactivated vaccine, that it cannot go in and cause disease. So those are the Chinese vaccines. So this is what the SARS-CoV-2 life cycle looks like. So this is the virus. You can see the outer coat, which protects the most important part of the vaccine, which is the nucleic acid or the RNA. Viruses can be what are called RNA viruses or DNA viruses. So this is a RNA virus. So the nucleic acid is RNA. The virus attaches to the cell. It gets internalized. This remains outside. The nucleic acid portion goes inside. And inside, it does a couple of things. One is replication. So replication means it produces copies of itself. The second thing that it does is translation, which means that it produces a template on the basis of which different proteins are produced. And so some of these proteins are structural proteins for the virus. And so these proteins they cover up one of these RNA templates that are produced. This is a new virus, and that virus buds out. And so this is just multiplication of the virus. And then the other thing is that, of course, it produces other proteins which cause problems inside the body. So now the vaccine, that's the COVID-19 vaccine, obviously large numbers of the virus vaccine cannot be produced at the same time. So there's going to be a phased approach to the vaccine. So some people are going to get it earlier, some people are going to get it later. I know there's been a lot of excitement about the vaccine being available, but we have to temper that with the understanding that it's going to take time for enough vaccine to get to the entire population. And so all governments across the world are going to start having policies about who gets the vaccine first. And so this is what's probably going to happen in the United States. The first phase is going to be the highest risk, people who are at highest risk. And phase 1A would be healthcare personnel and people who are living in long term acute care facilities. Phase 1B is going to be essential workers. Now, there's going to be politics about what's called essential and what's not essential. So, there's obviously going to be some politics in that part here. And then phase 1C would be adults who are considered to have high risk medical conditions and are above the age of 65. After that, is only after that will it go to other people. This is going to take some time. These are the two messenger RNA vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine has been said to be about 95% effective. The Moderna vaccine is also pretty close, about 94% effective. Now, the Pfizer vaccine, they've already started producing the vaccine because they expect FDA approval. They've already got paid, and so there's no harm in producing. So they've already started producing a lot of the vaccine. But even with all that, the FDA is expected to meet on the 10th of December, and probably on the 11th or 12th we'll have an approval. And so in anticipation of that, they're already producing the vaccine. They're already preparing to ship the vaccine all over the world. And they expect to produce about 50 million doses for the whole world by the end of 2020. So 50 million doses is a large amount, but 50 million doses means that's enough for 25 million people. 25 million people is not even 1% of the world population. Even if you exclude Russia and China, where you think they might have their own vaccines, if you assume that half the population lives in Russia and China, 50 million doses or 25 million people is less than 1% of the remaining half of the world. And so that just gives you an idea about how long it might take before we actually get vaccines for the general population. The Moderna vaccine, so this is a new company. This is really their first big product. And so they expect to produce 25 million doses nationally by the end of 2020. Even if they had the efficiency of Pfizer, you double this, we're still talking about 50 million people who can get vaccinated by the end of the year worldwide. And so that's less than 1% of the world population. So this is the state of the different vaccines. Now, Pfizer applied for the FDA approval November 20. We expect the FDA meeting on December 10th, and within the next few days, we expect an announcement of the FDA. Moderna applied about a week or 10 days later. We expect the Moderna vaccine also to be approved about a week after the Pfizer vaccine. In the United States, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, they make recommendations of vaccination. So they have already decided about what phase 1A is, but they need to provide vaccine recommendations to the rest of the population. The CDC usually follows the ACIP recommendations. So based on what they say, that'll influence who gets vaccinated and when. The other important things for messenger RNA vaccines, the symptoms are generally mild, but the symptoms are again very similar to the symptoms of COVID itself. And so after people get vaccinated, some of them are going to develop symptoms. Some of the symptoms are going to look like COVID symptoms. That might engender some testing for that. Important thing we need to know is that these are vaccines that have been studied very quickly. We don't have a lot of data on safety during pregnancy and breastfeeding, and that becomes important because 75% of the healthcare workforce is women. And we know that the healthcare workforce is the one that's going to get vaccinated first of all. And so there's still going to be some unknowns when we start vaccinating. This picture just gives you an idea about what would need to be done for vaccine distribution. Vaccine is sent to different countries in special packaging, keeping it very cold. In the countries, they have to store the vaccine really at minus 70 degrees Celsius, where they can actually do that for up to 6 months. They can actually store the vaccine at a lower temperature, up to about minus 20, but that has to be used within 10 days. And then once the vaccine is distributed, it can be dropped down to refrigeration temperatures. But if they do that, it has to be used within 5 days. So a lot of logistics has to be arranged in different places. Now, of course, who gets the vaccine in each country, the government will have to decide in each country. So I'll stop over there and I'll be happy to take questions. I'd like to thank Nasra Banu, our president, Sampurna, for organizing all this, the now executive committee. Caitlin Rivard is a pharmacist at the Cleveland Clinic from whom I got all our vaccine information. And then these are, of course, my family who really put up with me getting all this ready. And I will stop here and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dai. It was really information and studied. यति डिटेलमा हामीलाई अहिलेसम्म यति डिटेलमा मलाई त थाहा थिएन है. It's really great opportunity to have you here on now, and thank you so much. है. So अब यसमा चाहिँ we can start. जोसँग केही क्वेसनहरू छ तपाईँहरूसँग भने you can ask Nabin Dai. He is right here to answer. So anybody can go and start. And अरूले बोल्ने बेलामा प्लिज आफ्नो आफ्नो चाहिँ म्युट गर्नु होला, आफ्नो माइक म्युट गर्नु. Okay, so it looks like Pooja wants to ask something. Go ahead, Pooja.
Oh, thank you. First of all, Nabin, I thank you very much. It was a very informative talk, and I really appreciate it. And thank you now for organizing this. My question kind of surrounds around the senior citizens, elderly, especially the folks who have underlying conditions. Um, is there a reservation for like for those folks? Do you see the reservation for using antiviral medication and steroids, just given like the side effects and things like that? So how has we been treating the elderly folks? Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you for the question. So for remdesivir, the main reason not to use remdesivir would be if they have poor kidney function. And so in our hospitals, if people have poor kidney functions, they don't get remdesivir. As far as steroids are concerned, yes, if people come in and they're ill, they would all get steroids. Also, like I said, it's probably not effective. The remdesivir is probably not effective in the second week, but if people come to the hospital, they're ill, they almost all get remdesivir anyway. One of the things that I want, and I did not really get into the details of these studies, is that the efficacy of remdesivir, yes, it is effective, but it is not really all that effective. It is a little bit effective. And so some of the studies have been, the main studies that have been done have been limited. They did not really do the study to try to see if it reduces mortality. Means they have not really been able to show in any study that if you get remdesivir, the risk of dying is less than if you don't get remdesivir. So the main thing that they've shown is that people who get remdesivir, they remain in the hospital for a shorter period of time. That is the main thing that has been shown. Now, based on that, the FDA approved the medication, and so it is an approved medication in the United States. But there have also been many studies in other parts of the world. The biggest studies are the ones that are done by the WHO, that's called the Solidarity Trial. That has not been published. It's being reviewed right now, and it will be published in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think. But that one did not really find any benefit of remdesivir. And so the World Health Organization has actually recommended against using remdesivir. So for a rich country which has a lot of money, yes, you'll use remdesivir. But for poor countries, there's really, there's no recommendation to use remdesivir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja, for your question, and thank you, Nabin Dai. My answer question. Nabin Dai, yeah, it's really great presentation and great update. Really, I feel a lot of things from your presentation. That's really great. Like just one question. Like how long it takes for the entire population of United States to get vaccinated? Approximate time.
Now, I think at this time, no one really knows. But what I will say is that the 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 group 1, which is the healthcare workers, long-term acute care, essential workers, and the high-risk adults above the age of 65, they will probably get vaccinated by March.
Oh, okay.
So the rest of the population, I think it's going to take up to 6 months, to be very honest with you.
Oh, okay, great.
But I think we will know after about a month. The first month, right now, we really don't know what the vaccine distribution is going to look like. But by middle of January, we'll have some idea about how many people have actually gotten vaccinated. So I think we'll have a better idea then.
Okay, one more thing, Navin. It says that FDA has given emergency authorization for this vaccine. What does that mean?
So emergency means that at the time of this crisis, we have to approve this. And so they look at basic safety data, and they have certain criteria that you have to show certain things before they approve. So in this case, the FDA had very clear guidelines. You have to have so many people that you've tested. You have to have shown that so many people developed the illness. And then you have to show that it was protective over so much period of time, which is actually very short right now because it's maximum of 2 months or so. And so that's why it's an emergency use authorization, because there's a pandemic going on now. We have to do something, and so based on these, they would make an approval, but they will ask for additional data after that. And in the case of this vaccine, it really does not really matter, because by the time the pandemic will be gone. But in the case of other medications, they would have to get full approval later after they have more data.
Now, the one more thing. Where these vaccines are produced, in the animal, which animal or human, where, what is the means, or in the laboratory?
No, different vaccines are produced in different ways, but the messenger RNA vaccines, those are produced in laboratories. In the labs, yes. So the big thing about the messenger RNA vaccine is that the messenger RNA really contains the genetic code that would produce the proteins of the virus. But it's not enough to actually become infectious. It's not enough to produce the entire virus. So that's the whole idea. You put in the messenger RNA, it goes in very much like a virus. It goes inside the cell. It uses the body's machinery to produce all the proteins. The proteins are expressed, and then the body produces antibodies. But it does not replicate and produce viral illness.
Got it, got it. One more thing, and that will be the last. Don't you just say that they are against the herd immunity? What does that mean?
So what herd immunity means, that if you have in the population, if you have a large number of people who are immune to the virus, immune either because they previously had the illness, or immune because they got the vaccine and have antibodies, then it cannot really spread from person to person all that easily. And so when you have enough of that to prevent the spreading in the community, then that's called effective herd immunity.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Nabin, guys.
you're welcome.
Appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Actually, I will go next. I have a question.
Yes.
अरूहरू चाहिँ प्लिज आफ्नो क्वेसन रेडी राखेर बस्नु होला एउटा क्वेसन छ ओके सो नवीन दाई तपाईँको प्रेजेन्टेसन अघि नगर्दाखेरि 14 days is maximum after quarantine. The 14 days is safe to meet the people who has that COVID positive result भन्नु भएन. So but when I talk to when I try to make an appointment with the Cleveland clinic and talk to the person, they are like, no, they require 28 days. They cannot make an appointment if the person has not finished his 28 days after the test, positive test. So why is that?
Yeah, I don't know what that policy is, and because we see patients who've had positive tests recently. I think the important thing is that you really should be wearing a mask, and different places might have their own policy about what they want to do. I don't know about that, because at the Cleveland Clinic, if one of the healthcare workers becomes ill, then 10 days after the onset of symptoms, they're allowed to come back to work. Even they don't need to be tested again. Even if they're tested and even if they're positive, after 10 days they can come back to work.
Wow, okay. So I tried to make an appointment for my client and they refused to make it. Even it's after 14 days. They refused to make it.
Which department is that?
Sorry?
Which department? Kun department?
Oh, both. Even one was, I totally understand, one was with something lungs problem. So she had ultrasound for that, and another was just a physical appointment, and they refused to make it.
That should not be happening. म भोलि बुझेर तपाईलाई भन्छु नि. हाम्रो त्यस्तो policies अब छैन भनेर म बुझेर भन्छु नि तपाईलाई.
And I tried like 3-4 times actually. मेरो दुईजना क्लाइन्टलाई त्यस्तो पोजिटिभ आयो हैन, and after 14 days I tried 2-3 times and they refused it in different departments. So they always say that this is our policy, we can't make an appointment if after getting the positive result, and we have to wait until 28 days.
Makes no sense because कतिजना मान्छेलाई
Yeah.
टेस्ट गरेन भने थाहै हुँदैन नि उनीहरूको छ कि छैन भनेर
Yeah.
होइन
And like अब त्यो जुन एपोइन्टमेन्ट बनाउने बेलामा हुन्छ नि अब मैले नै त्यो कोभिडको लागि टेस्टको लागि एपोइन्टमेन्ट बनाएँ होइन सो आई पुट टु सेन्ड इट टु देयर प्राइमरी डक्टर अर वेयर दे गो visit doctors. So they already knew that this patient has COVID. So they said refuse गरेर मलाई. So I don't know. I could not understand either. So yeah, मेरो एउटा चाहिँ क्वेसन छ त्यसो दाइलाई त्यो पोलिसिजहरू अब आफ्नो होला क्लिन एन्ड क्लिनको आई डोन्ट नो वाइ सो अर्को मेरो क्वेसन छ सो दाइले भन्नुभयो नि अब 10 days is maximum and they can go back to work or see the people. So after 2 weeks can we see the people face to face?
Oh yes. हाम्रो क्लिनिक क्लिनिकमा सुरुमा के थियो भने 10 days पछि काममा आउने तर 2 weeks तर त्यस काममा आएपछि अझै 1 week चाहिँ फेस टु फेस पेसेन्ट नहेर्ने भनेर पोलिसी थियो तर त्यो पनि अहिले उनीहरूले स्क्रैप गर्यो अहिले 10 days पछि काममा आउँदा हुन्छ र फेस टु फेस पेसेन्ट हेर्दा पनि हुन्छ तर कस्तो हुन्छ भने 10 days पछि काममा आउँदा पनि सबैले मास्क लगाइरहेको हुन्छ होइन त्यो बिरामीको पेसेन्ट पनि फर्केर आउँदा मास्क लगाइरहेको हुन्छ अलिअलि भाइरस अझै बाँकी छ भने त्यो मास्कले प्रोटेक्ट गरिहाल्छ नि ट्रान्समिसन रिस्क त जिरो नै भने पनि हुन्छ प्र्याक्टिकली जिरो नै हुन्छ
किनभने फेस टु फेस एपोइन्टमेन्टहरू भइरहेको हुन्छ उनीहरूसँग अनि द्याट्स राइट यो क्वेसन र आन्सर चाहिँ मेरो लागि धेरै इम्पोर्टेन्ट थियो
मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट चाहिँ नि मास्क लाउनुपर्छ होइन मास्क लगाएको छ भने रिस्क अफ ट्रान्समिसन क्लोज टु जिरो नै हुन्छ दुईजनाले मास्क लगाएको छ भने रिस्क अफ ट्रान्समिसन क्लोज टु जिरो अब विदिन द हाइएस्ट पिक भएको 2 to 3 days आफ्टर द अनसेट अफ सिम्टम्स त्यतिखेर चाहिँ मेबी अ स्मल चान्स अफ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन होइन त्यो पनि मान्छेले चिच्याइरहेको छ के गरिरहेको छ भने तर त्यही पनि त्यतिखेर पनि मास्क लगाइरहेको छ भने रिस्क अफ ट्रान्समिसन सुड बी भेरी स्मल
So mask and this both are important or just mask भएपछि नजिक गए पनि it's okay?
हजुर मास्क लगाएपछि नजिकै गए पनि हुन्छ
Oh wow. Okay.
अब त्यो पहिलाको त्यो सुपर स्प्रेडर इभेन्टहरू भन्ने जे भनेको थियो नि त्यो चाहिँ कस्तो हुन्छ भने अब त्यसमा धेरै न्युजमा के आएको छ तर मोस्ट प्रब्लम के भयो भने कुनै पेसेन्ट उसको हाई भाइरल लोड भएको बेला हाई भाइरल लोड भनेको मेबी जस्ट बिफोर द डे अफ अन सिम्टम्स सुरु हुनुभन्दा अघिल्लो दिन भाइरल लोड निकै माथि हुन्छ त्यस्तो बेलामा गएर अब गीत गाइरहेको छ कुनै पार्टीमा भने त्यो धेरै एरोसोलाइजेसन भयो नि त्यसो गर्दा अनि त्यस्तो बारेमा कसैले मास्क लगाएको थिएन त्यस्तो सिचुएसनमा स्प्रेड हुन्छ अब आइसियुमा कुनै पेसेन्ट अरू बेला होइन त्यो उनीहरूको हाई आएको उनीहरूको सिम्टम्स सुरु भएको 1-2 दिन पछि हस्पिटलमा भयो उनीहरूले के गरेर आइसियुमा लानु पर्यो उनीहरूलाई अब त्यो सक्सन गर्नु पर्यो त्यो पोजिटिभ एयर प्रेसर दिनु पर्यो त्यस्तो तिनीहरूलाई चाहिँ एरोसोल जेनेरेटिङ प्रोसिजर्स भन्छ त्यो हावा बेसरी ठेलेर धेरै पार्टिकल्स बाहिर निस्किने त्यस्तो सिचुएसनमा फैलिने धेरै चान्स हुन्छ त्यस्तोमा चाहिँ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन पनि हुनसक्छ त्यो बाहेक ट्रान्समिसन हुने मुख्य ड्रपलेट्सबाट हो अनि दुवैजनाले मास्क लाग्छ भने त्यो ट्रान्समिसन हुने चान्स क्लोज टु जिरो नै हुन्छ
It's a very great information. साँच्चीकै थाहा थिएन. We were like, okay, distance पनि maintain गर, mask पनि लगाऊ. We were doing that, but still that's more safer. But
Oh, exactly.
It's, you know, yeah.
मुख्य तपाईँ बाहिर कहीँ जानुभएको छ भने कुनै मान्छे मास्क लगाएको छैन भने त्यो मान्छेबाट एटलिस्ट 6 feet 10 feet पर बस्नुहोस् कुरा त्यही हो
Okay. Okay, यो गुड न्युजले एउटा के फाइदा भयो भने नेक्स्टचोटि केही गरी नआएको पार्टी गर्दै मन लागेको रहेछ भने सबैजना मास्क लगाएर आयो
होइन अब यहाँ त अब त्यो ग्यादरिङहरू नै नगर्नु भन्ने हुन्छ होइन त्यो पोलिटिकली राम्रो देखिँदैन
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I'm just making it. So, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anybody wants to go?
Aisa Singh ने बोलते वाले सोचना
Okay. I don't see her here. Okay. Aisa got it. I think you are mute or something. We can't hear you.
She's not mute.
Aisa Singh is here.
She's there. I said anyone ask a question? I see her name there.
I think so.
Aisha is typing. She just said hi. Aisha, you can go ahead and ask your question. If you
Cannot speak through phone.
So it looks like that.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and type. In the meantime, line काट्नु पर्ला चाहिँ के अरे टेस्टिङको टाइम चाहिँ मैले मेरो पेसेन्टहरूबाट पनि धेरै नै यो एकदमै बर्निङ क्वेसन जस्तो लाग्छ मलाई सबैजनालाई कतिखेर म टेस्ट गराउँ मान्छेसँग एक्सपोज भइसकेपछि कहिले गएर टेस्ट गराउँ एक्चुअली तपाईँले अघि प्रेजेन्टेसनमा भनिदिनु भयो तर एक्चुअली जस्ट रेपिटेसनको लागि फेरि एकचोटि भनिदिनु
किन हामी के देखेको छ भने अब कुनै मान्छेलाई एक्सपोजर भयो भने एक्सपोजर भएको सबैजना बिरामी हुने पनि होइन सबैजनालाई ट्रान्समिसन हुने पनि होइन तर जो बिरामी हुन्छन् एक्सपोजर भइसकेपछि आधीजनालाई 5 दिनभित्र सिम्टम्स सुरु भइसक्छ 95% मान्छेलाई विदिन 14 डेज सिम्टम्स सुरु भइसकेको हुन्छ होइन अब टेस्ट गर्ने नै हो भने अब 14 दिनसम्म पर्ख्यो भने त टेस्ट गर्नै पर्दैन किनभने त्यतिसँग भएन भने त भएन भने थाहा भइहाल्यो टेस्ट गर्ने नै हो भने एक्सपोजरको हप्ता दिनसम्म पर्खेर टेस्ट गऱ्यो भने त्यतिखेर नेगेटिभ आयो भने ढुक्कै भयो हुन्छ ट्रान्समिसन भएन भनेर
Aishaको क्वेसन थियो सो हाउ लङ डु कोभिड पेशेन्ट विल ह्याभ कफ एन्ड कोल्ड
त्यो चाहिँ एकदमै भेरिएबल हुन्छ किन कुनै पेसेन्ट कोहीमा 3-4 दिनपछि ठिक भइहाल्छ उनीहरूलाई तर कोहीलाई चाहिँ कति हप्तासम्म हुनसक्छ धेरै जसो मान्छेलाई हप्ता 10 दिनमा सबै सिम्टम्स गइसक्छ धेरै जसो भनेको 70-75% मान्छेलाई हप्ता दिन जतिमा सिम्टम्स बेसिकली गइसकेकै हुन्छ तर 75% नभनौँ अब 2/3 हप्ता 10 दिनमा गइसक्छ बट 1/3 चाहिँ अलिक धेरै टाइमको लागि सिम्टम्स हुन्छ कोहीलाई कति हप्तासम्म पनि भएको मैले देखेको छु
त्यो जुन हाम्रो भाइरल कफहरू जुन लिङ्गर अन हुन्छ नि त्यस्तै यो पनि कफ लिङ्गर अन हुन्छ
त्योभन्दा अलिक ज्यादा नै हो किनभने अब कफ भने भिन्दै कुरा हो त्यो भाइरल कफ त हुनसक्छ तर यसमा चाहिँ मान्छेलाई त्यो एकदमै त्यो टेम्परेचर ज्वरो पनि आउने र एकदमै त्यो नाइट स्वेट्स पनि हुने सब पसिना पनि धेरै आउने त्यो पनि मैले 3-4 हप्ताको लागि भएको देखेको छु अब त्यो कोही पेसेन्ट्स धेरै बिरामी भएर हस्पिटलाइज भएको भिन्दै कुरा हो यो हस्पिटलाइज नभएको पेसेन्टहरूमा पनि कोहीलाई चाहिँ निकै टाइमसम्म सिम्टम्स आउन सक्छ Does it last for a month? अर्को चाहिँ एउटा अर्को पोली अन्डरस्टुड चाहिँ के छ भने पोस्ट कोभिड सिन्ड्रोम भन्ने नाम दिएको छ त्यो चाहिँ अलिक पोली अन्डरस्टुड हो त्यो चाहिँ कोही मान्छेमा नट जस्ट अ मन्थ फर 2 or 3 months कुनै न कुनै सिम्टम्स रहन सक्छ अब सिम्टम्स भनेको कोहीलाई रेस्पिरेटरी सिम्टम्स हुन्छ कफहरू जस्तै कोहीलाई त्यो एकदम फिटिग जस्तो हुनसक्छ कोहीलाई सम न्युरोलोजिकल सिम्टम्स हुनसक्छ त्यो चाहिँ अब अलिक पोली अन्डरस्टुड कुरा नै हो तर कोहीलाई हुनसक्छ तर के भन्छ भने प्रब्ली 85-90% मान्छेलाई त्यो रिकभर गर्छ त्यस्तो 1 month जस्तो लास्ट गर्दैन नमस्ते ए सञ्जय दाइ नमस्ते
नमस्ते क्वेसन थियो नि के यो एनुअल भ्याक्सिन हुन्छ होला कि जस्तै कि यो वान टाइम भ्याक्सिन
त्यो अहिले भन्न सकिँदैन किनभने भ्याक्सिन प्रोटेक्सन भनेर अहिले जुन स्टडिज भएको छ त्यो अब जम्मा 2 महिनाको लागि मात्रै थाहा छ 2 महिनासम्म प्रोटेक्ट गर्छ होइन त्योभन्दा कति टाइम प्रोटेक्ट गर्छ भनेको त्यो अहिले थाहा हुनै सक्दैन अलिक पछि मात्रै थाहा हुन्छ किनभने अब त्यति राम्रो स्टडी भएकै छैन त्यो एउटा कुरा हो अनि अर्को चाहिँ फेरि अब इन्फ्लुएन्जाको एभ्री इयर हामीले अर्को लिनुपर्ने कारण चाहिँ त्यो भ्याक्सिन लङ टर्म इफेक्टिभ नहुने होइन त्यो चाहिँ के भन्छ भने भाइरस नै फेरिन्छ म्युटेसन भएर अनि अर्को साल अर्कै भाइरस हुन्छ त्यसैले अर्को भ्याक्सिन चाहिन्छ कोरोना भाइरस अहिलेसम्म त्यस्तो म्युटेसन इन्फ्लुएन्जा जस्तो भएको देखेको छैन अनि त्यसैले होपफुली त्यस्तो नहोला
कति मान्छेहरूलाई पोजिटिभ भइसकेकोहरू उनीहरूले पनि भ्याक्सिन लगाउनु पर्ने हुन्छ कि उनीहरूले नलगाएको हुन्छ?
अब त्यो तपाईँले अफिसियल रेकमेन्डेसन देख्नुभयो भने के भन्छ भने उनीहरूले के छुट्याउँदैन, सबैलाई भ्याक्सिन लाउनु भनिरहेको हुन्छ। अनि अब त्यो सबैले भ्याक्सिन लाउनु नै अफिसियल रेकमेन्डेसन चाहिँ त्यही नै हुन्छ। तर हेऱ्यो भने जसलाई इन्फेक्सन भएको छ उनीहरूलाई फेरि इन्फेक्सन भएको चाहिँ एकदमै कम देखेको छ। अब कतिजनालाई फेरि भयो भन्ने कति सुन्नुहुन्छ न्युजमा, मोस्ट अफ द्याट इज ननसेन्स। उनीहरूलाई फेरि भएको होइन। मैले त्यो अघि एक्सप्लेन गरेको थियो टेस्टहरूको लो भाइरल लोड भएपछि कुनै टेस्ट पोजिटिभ कुनै टेस्ट नेगेटिभ आउने अनि मान्छे कति हप्तासम्म पोजिटिभ रहन सक्ने कुरा त्यही हो। उनीहरूको के भने एकपल्ट भइसक्यो उनीहरूले निको भयो, पछि अर्को कुनै रोग लागेको बेलामा उनीहरूले टेस्ट गर्दा फेरि त्यो पोजिटिभ टेस्ट आयो, त्यो फेरि कोरोना भाइरस लागेको होइन। साँच्चै नै कोरोना भाइरस सेकेन्ड टाइम भएको भनेको अहिले मैले भने कति 65 मिलियन जति पेसेन्ट्समा भइसक्यो होइन। वर्ल्ड वाइड 5-6 जना मात्रै हो जहाँ चाहिँ फेरि सेकेन्ड टाइम भयो भनेर भन्नु सकिन्छ कन्फिडेन्टली। त्यसले सेकेन्ड टाइम भएको चाहिँ देखिएको छैन। अनि एकपल्ट कोरोना भाइरस डेफिनेटली कोरोना भाइरस भइसकेको पेसेन्टले भ्याक्सिन नलाए पनि मेरो विचारमा उनीहरूलाई त्यो ठिकै हुनुपर्ने, त्यो भ्याक्सिनले के प्रोटेक्ट गर्ने त होइन।
अनि मलाई अर्को मेरो लास्ट क्वेसन चाहिँ के छ भन्दाखेरि बच्चाहरू र प्रेग्नेन्ट वुमेनहरू कुनै केही स्टडी गरेको छ कि छैन यसमा?
त्यो प्रेग्नेन्ट वुमेनहरूमा छैन, बच्चाहरूमा म भन्न सक्दिनँ। तर प्रेग्नेन्ट वुमेनहरूको त्यही क्वेसन छ अहिले। अब त्यसमा के इफेक्ट हुन्छ अहिले भन्नै सक्दैन, किनभने प्रेग्नेन्सी इफेक्टहरू हुनु त अब एटलिस्ट अ फ्यु मन्थ्स डेटा नभइकन भन्न सकिँदैन। अनि त्यसरी प्रेग्नेन्सीमा के इफेक्ट हुन्छ अहिले त्यो भन्न सकिँदैन। तर त्यो भने अब तर यो मेसेन्जर आरएनए भ्याक्सिन भनेको एक्चुअली त्यो पुरा भाइरस पनि गएको होइन, खालि मेसेन्जर आरएनए जुनले त्यो प्रोटिन बनाउँछ त्यो पार्ट मात्रै गएको हो। मेसेन्जर आरएनए भनेको बडीमा गएपछि बडीले प्रिटी क्विकली त्यसलाई डिस्ट्रोय पनि गरिहाल्छ। अनि अहिले भ्याक्सिन बनाएको त्यसलाई अब प्रोटेक्ट गर्दै लाने, उनीहरूले त्यो अलिकति प्रोटिन बनाउनु चाहिँ त्यसलाई जोगाउने हो, त्यसपछि हाम्रो जिउले त्यसलाई डिस्ट्रोय गरिहाल्नु पर्ने। त्यसैले त्यति हार्मफुल हुनुपर्ने भन्छु। अरू भाइरसहरू भन्दा सेफ नै हुनुपर्ने यो मेसेन्जर आरएनए भ्याक्सिन्स मेरो विचारमा नि। अब अरू भ्याक्सिनहरू हेर्नुभयो भने त्यही आरएनए भ्याक्सिनहरू भनिरहेको छ नि, तिनीहरू चाहिँ अरू भ्याक्सिनहरूभन्दा सेफ नै हुनुपर्ने। खालि नयाँ हो त्यसरी हामीलाई थाहा छैन, तर त्यसको मेकानिजम होइन। मेसेन्जर आरएनए यो पहिलोपल्ट हो, योभन्दा अगाडि कहिल्यै गरेको छैन। अनि त्यसैले मान्छेमा क्वेसन्स छ नयाँ भएकोले। अरू एडेनोभाइरस भ्याक्सिनहरू भनेको तिनीहरू त एक्चुअली भाइरस नै छिराउनु पर्छ बडीमा नि, तर तिनीहरूले रोग नगर्ने भाइरस छिराएको, तर त्यो त लाइभ भाइरस नै हो। यो मेसेन्जर आरएनए भ्याक्सिनमा त कुनै पनि लाइभ भाइरस त्यो पठाएको होइन जिउभित्र नि। त्यसैले सेफ्टी राम्रो हुनुपर्ने यसको। थ्याङ्क यू।
Thank you, Sanjay. So there is more question from Sampurna. Do you want to read it on the chat room?
Aisha is again asking, does the lab inform the confirmed cases about viral load here in US instead of just informing them test results? Because I was informed that hospitals in Nepal have been classifying the cases according to viral loads.
भाइरल लोड यस्तो छ यहाँ नि, अब भिन्दै खालको टेस्ट भयो। अब एन्टिजेन टेस्ट गर्दा खालि त्यो पोजिटिभ नेगेटिभ मात्रै आउँछ, अनि त्यसमा भाइरल लोड त्यो कति भाइरस छ भन्न सकिँदैन। पिसिआर टेस्टहरू गर्दा चाहिँ त्यो एक्चुअली पिसिआर टेस्ट बाई द भेरी डिजाइन अफ पिसिआर टेस्ट दे आर क्वान्टिटेटिभ। किनभने त्यो पिसिआर टेस्ट भनेको उनीहरूले एम्प्लिफाई गर्छ, फेरि डिटेक्ट गरेको इच साइकल उनीहरूले हेर्दै हेर्दै जान्छ। अनि चाँडो डिटेक्ट भयो भने त्यो भाइरल लोड हाई छ, पछि भने भाइरल लोड कम छ, इजिली क्यालकुलेट गर्न सकिन्छ कति हो भाइरल लोड भनेर। तर प्रब्लम के हो भने एफडिएले यो टेस्टहरूलाई एज अ क्वालिटेटिभ टेस्ट मात्रै अप्रुभ गरेको छ, उनीहरूले एज अ क्वान्टिटेटिभ टेस्ट अप्रुभ गरेको छैन। त्यसैले ल्याबहरूले रिजल्ट दिँदा पोजिटिभ नेगेटिभ मात्रै भन्न पाउँछ। दे क्यानट टेल यु द्याट दिस इज द भाइरल लोड। हामी एज डक्टर्स हामीलाई भाइरल लोड एकदमै काम लाग्छ कति पेसेन्टहरूमा, अनि हामी चाहिँ पछाडि गएर ल्याबलाई सोध्छौँ यसको भाइरल लोड कति थियो भनेर। हामीलाई इन्फर्मली उनीहरूले भन्छ, भाइरल इन्फर्मेसन हुन्छ, तर उनीहरूले अफिसियली त्यो रिपोर्ट आउट गर्न पाउँदैन।
say thank you to Nabin bhai.
Okay. Thank you, Aisha ji.
Ganesh, like, go ahead. Moving to the next. Who is the next? Ganesh, right?
Hi, Ganesh bhai, actually this is your brother.
Continuity Vasla.
मेरो question it's surrounding basically kids अनि quarantine गर्ने it's around that area. अहिले त बच्चाहरू हुन्छ नि घरैमा छन् स्कुल गएको छैनन् अब slowly after probably after Christmas they'll be going back to school होइन and when they go to school अब यो त time where they're going to have a lot of upper respiratory infectionsहरू अनि घरमा आएर infection हुन्छ so when to अब स्कुलले त नपठाऊ भन्छ when do we decide to like have them tested for COVID र चाहिँ आफू पनि अब हुन्छ नि how do we keep ourselves do we have to keep ourselves apart अनि work मा आउने जाने गर्नलाई चाहिँ do you have any suggestions नवीनलाई for that
होइन ग्रेट क्वेसन्स होइन अब यो चाहिँ सबैलाई आउने क्वेसनहरू जसको जसको बच्चाहरू छ स्कुल जाने सबैलाई आउने क्वेसनहरू यो भन्नु गाह्रै छ किनभने बच्चाहरूलाई स्कुल पठाउँदा अब अलिकति रिस्क हुन्छ नो क्वेसन कुनै पनि ग्यादरिङमा जाँदा अलिकति रिस्क हुन्छ तर अब त्यसमा स्कुलहरूले कतिको उनीहरूले के कस्तो खालको अर्गनाइजेसन छ स्कुलमा त्यसमा रियली डिपेन्ड गर्छ अब राम्रो राम्रो स्कुल डिस्ट्रिक्टहरूमा उनीहरूले धेरै राम्रो गर्छ फर इक्जाम्पल हाम्रो बिचमा अस्ति 1-1.5 महिनाको लागि स्कुलमा गइरहेको थिए बच्चाहरू उनीहरूको साह्रै राम्रो थियो अरेन्जमेन्टहरू उनीहरूले अब सबै बच्चाहरूलाई क्लियरली 6 फिट अपार्ट राख्ने डेस्कहरूमा उनीहरूको डिसइन्फेक्ट गर्ने सबै व्यवस्था गरेर मलाई चाहिँ फुल कन्फिडेन्स त्यहाँ स्प्रेड हुँदैन भनेर फेरि सबै बच्चाले मास्क लाउनै पर्ने उनीहरूले अब खानुलाई मास्क खोल्नु पर्यो तर उनीहरूले कस्तो गरेर अर्गनाइज गरेको थियो नि बिहान एक ग्रुप आउने अनि उनीहरू लन्चमाको लागि घर जाने र घरै बस्ने आफ्टरनुनमा अर्को ग्रुप आउने लन्च घरमै खायो त्यसो गर्दा स्कुलमा उनीहरूले मास्क खोल्नै परेन त्यस्तो गरेपछि स्प्रेड हुने चान्स त जिरो क्लोज प्र्याक्टिकली जिरो नै थियो त्यस्तो खालको अरेन्जमेन्ट गर्यो भने कुनै प्रब्लमै हुँदैन तर अब सबै स्कुल डिस्ट्रिक्टमा त्यसरी नगर्ला अनि त्यस्तै भन्नु गाह्रो छ जहाँ चाहिँ त्यो अरेन्जमेन्ट्स ठिक छैन त्यहाँ डेफिनेटली स्प्रेड हुन्छ आफ्नो
so that question चाहिँ but do we kind of like pursue कि अब हुन्छ नि अब
टेस्ट कहिले गराउने
टेस्ट गर्ने नगर्ने अब घरैमा राख्ने कि अब अफकोर्स स्कुलले त घरैमा राख्न भन्छ होइन do we go ahead and like ask for testing or like how do we go about it
अब यो कस्तो हुन्छ नि the best way to approach this would be how you would do this during any other winter होइन अलिकति रुगा लाग्दा हामी टेस्ट गराउँदैनौँ होइन अलिकति अब ज्वरो आएको जस्तो भयो बडी एक जस्तो भयो भने टेस्ट गराउने यहाँ चाहिँ त्यस्तै अब इन्फ्लुएन्जा जस्तो लाग्यो भने टेस्ट गराउने इन एडिसन टु द्याट माइल्ड इलनेस भयो बट देयर इज अ लस अफ सेन्स लस अफ टेस्ट अर स्मेल त्यो भयो भने चाहिँ डेफिनेटली टेस्ट गराउने अब यो विन्टर हाम्रो कस्तो भने अरू विन्टर रेस्पिरेटरी भाइरसेस भनेर मेन टेस्टिङ चाहिँ इन्फ्लुएन्जा ए इन्फ्लुएन्जा बी आरएसभीको लागि हुन्थ्यो यो विन्टरमा चाहिँ कस्तो हुन्छ भने इन्फ्लुएन्जा ए इन्फ्लुएन्जा बी आरएसभी एन्ड COVID-19 टेस्ट हुन्छ त्यसरी नै बेस्ट सोच्ने त्यही तरिका नै हो अरू विन्टर जस्तै हो तर इन्स्टेड अफ टेस्टिङ फर दोज 3 viruses वी टेस्ट फर 4 viruses वेन वी टेस्ट अब कहिले टेस्ट गर्ने भनेको चाहिँ अब इच टाइम अलिकति खोकी लाग्ने टेस्ट गर्नु पनि त्यो ओभर रियाक्सन हुन्छ होइन तर डेफिनेटली लस अफ सेन्स लस अफ स्मेल अर टेस्ट भयो भने चाहिँ डेफिनेटली टेस्ट गराउने बिकज दोज आर सो अनयुजुअल सिम्टम्स अरू चिजले हुँदैन त्यस्तो भने चाहिँ डेफिनेटली टेस्ट गराउने नभए अलिकति त्यो ज्वरो त्यो अलिक इल भएको जस्तो इन्फ्लुएन्जा भएको कि जस्तो लाग्यो भने चाहिँ टेस्ट गराउने तर बेस्ट पल चाहिँ जस्तो गरे पनि अब अलिकति सन्चो भएन भने बेस्ट जस्ट पुट अन अ मास्क चान्स अफ स्प्रेडिङ कमै हुन्छ इभन इनसाइड द हाउस होल्ड अहिले पनि COVID-19 को विदिन अ हाउस होल्ड स्प्रेड चाहिँ about 50% लाई स्प्रेड हुन्छ होइन 50% भनेको त्यो चाहिँ अब युजुअल कोर्स अफ थिङ्समा अब 50% स्प्रेड हुन्छ त्यो 50% स्प्रेड भनेको अब त्यो सस्पेक्टेड मान्छेलाई मास्क लगाइदियो भने 50% भन्दा कमै भइहाल्छ घर इभन इनसाइड हाउस होल्ड
I think that helps a lot. Thank you, Dai.
थ्याङ्क यू
अर्को भाउजू के अरे अनुभव त्यसमा म एउटा एड गर्छु मैले मेरो क्लिनिकमा हेरेको पेसेन्टहरूको चाहिँ कस्तो छ भने अब बच्चाहरू त आउँछ नि भाइरल इन्फेक्सन लिएर टाइम हो भाइरल इन्फेक्सन लिएर आउने,
हो।
त्यसले मेरो म्याक्सिमम् केसेसहरू त्यस्तै नै हुन्छ। तर अब दाइले भने जस्तै एउटा केस थियो जसमा चाहिँ टेस्ट सेन्सेसन कम्प्लिटली गइसकेको थियो, चेक गर्दाखेरि द्याट किड वाज कोभिड पोजिटिभ, त्यो एउटा भयो होइन, एउटा टिपिकल सिनारी भयो। तर अब अर्को चाहिँ अब त्यो त्यो फिजिसियनकै डिसिजनमा पर्छ। कहिलेकाहीँ जस्ट कफ भएर मात्र आउँदाखेरि म्याक्सिमम् हामीले गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ नेगेटिभ आउने चान्सेस बढी हुन्छ होइन, किनभने अब त्यो नर्मल पहिलाकै जुन नर्मल जुन कमन कोल्ड गर्ने राइनो र एडिनो जुन किट्सहरूमा सानो बढी हुन्छ त्यो छँदैछ त्यहाँ होइन। अब अलिक बढी भयो भने मात्र त्यो फिजिसियनले पिडियाट्रिसियनले आफ्नो आफ्नो नलेज आफ्नो त्यो डिसिजन गरेर मात्रै गर्ने हो। तर म्याक्सिमम् चाहिँ अब नर्मली चाहिँ त्यो भाइरल युआरआई नै भइरहेको हुन्छ, नर्मल अरू पहिलाकै भाइरल युआरआई।
त्यो बच्चाहरूमा अलिक गाह्रो छ भन्नु नि, किनभने त्यसै पनि त्यो अरू कमन भाइरसेस पनि भइरहेकै हुन्छ, भन्नु अलिक गाह्रो छ। तर अहिले कोभिड-19 यति धेरै छ अहिले, कस्तो भने युजली एडिक्वेट टेस्टिङ भयो भने प्रब्लम बिट्विन 5 to 10% अफ केसेस सुड बी पोजिटिभ। अब हाम्रो यो थर्ड वेभ आउनुभन्दा अगाडि जति टेस्ट गर्थ्यौँ क्लिनिकमा त्यही बिट्विन 3 to 5% पोजिटिभ आइरहेको हुन्थ्यो। अहिले टेस्ट गर्दा अप टु 30-35% पोजिटिभ छ। भनेपछि कम्युनिटीमा अहिले धेरै नै छ यो कोभिड-19, अनि अलिक शङ्का लाग्यो भने टेस्ट गरिहाल्ने।
Sampurna, do you want to read that?
I said asking, I work at CPH, I am not sure what that is, but and we have been getting high volume of reinfected cases even after 100 days. Patients are reinfected with positive result and symptoms. As a result, we are sending them isolation quarantine orders but not conducting interviews. Do you think this is a feasible method to deal with reinfection, or do we think they do not need to quarantine? Cleveland Department of Public Health. Thank you for that.
That is very surprising. After 100 days, that is really surprising, and we should really look at that, because at the clinic we've done I think over 250,000 tests, and whenever we've looked at this in people who've been ill for a while, after a couple of weeks the viral load is always very low. So 100 days is a lot. That's 3 months. I don't know that it should still be positive then. I think the important thing is to see if the viral load is high in those cases. Maybe we should talk offline and see if at least some of those cases are Cleveland Clinic patients. I can check and see what their viral load is and see. Aishaji, if you can contact me later, we should probably look into this, because this would be very surprising.
Okay, thank you, Kapsa. Thank you, Dai. Gita raised hand. Oh. Alexa is saying something again.
I'll go next.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Gita, you are mute.
मलाई भन्नुभएको? I was waiting for Ganesh then.
Oh, okay. एकचोटि कुनै कम्पिटिसन फाइट गर्नु न, अनि राम्रो फर्स्ट. Okay, Ganesh, I go ahead.
हजुरले प्रेजेन्टेसनमा त्यो कति धेरैवटा भ्याक्सिनहरूको हामीलाई इन्फर्म गराउनु भयो। हामीले त दुईटा मात्रै सुनेको थियो, फाइजर र मोडेर्ना भनेर होइन। अनि यो भ्याक्सिनहरूको अप्रुभल केसमा कुनै एउटाले फेडरल बडीबाट प्रेसिडेन्स पाउने जस्तो हुन्छ कि हुँदैन, डिपेन्डिङ अन हाउ दे आर इफेक्टिभ, त्यो डोजमा, स्टोरेजमा, उनीहरूको अरू के कुरा हो, स्टेबिलिटीकोमा, नम्बर अफ इयर्स अफ स्टडी, त्यो सबै कुरा हेरेर कुनै एउटाले प्रेसिडेन्ट दिन सक्छ।
होइन अहिले कस्तो छ भने भ्याक्सिनहरू जस्तो भए पनि इफेक्टिभ भ्याक्सिन छ भने हामीलाई चाहिरहेकै हुन्छ होइन त्यस्तै अब यिनीहरू 90% मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट क्वेसन चाहिँ इफेक्टिभ छ कि छैन अनि अब 90% यिनीहरू भयो अब अहिले चाहिरहेको बेलामा कुनै भ्याक्सिन 70% 75% इफेक्टिभ छ भने पनि त्यो पनि मोस्ट प्रब्ली अप्रुभ गर्ने हो उनीहरूले अहिलेको बेलामा किनभने अहिले मोस्ट 75% इफेक्टिभ भयो भने पनि इट्स बेटर देन नथिङ होइन अनि जति पपुलेसन जति धेरैलाई इम्युनाइज गर्न सक्यो त्यति राम्रो
ओके अनि नेक्स्ट क्वेसन है त्यो क्याटेगोरीहरू अलमोस्ट प्रायोरिटाइज गरेर आयो है हेल्थ केयर वर्कर र सिनियर सिटिजन र प्रि एक्जिस्टिङ कन्डिसन भएकोलाई भनेर अनि हजुरले भनेकै डेटा अनुसार इट्स सेड कि बाई 2020 50 मिलियन डोजेस चाहिँ प्रड्युस हुन्छ भनेर अनि यो नम्बर अफ डोजेस र हेल्थ केयर पपुलेसन काम गर्ने मान्छेहरूको पपुलेसन कति छ सिनियर सिटिजनहरू कति छ भनेको त्यो सबै साइड बाई साइड गइरहेको हो कि एजम्सन अथवा जस्ट एउटा सर्टेन नम्बर 50 मिलियन
अनि हेल्थ केयर वर्कर्स त्यो एल्डरली त्यो फेज 1मा जुन हुनुपर्ने त्यो मोर देन 50 मिलियन नै हुनु होला इन द युनाइटेड स्टेट्स अलोन अब त्यो 50 मिलियन डोजेस चाहिँ त्यो वर्ल्ड वाइडको लागि 50 मिलियन त्यसको आधी नै युएसएले राखे पनि त्यसको आधी मात्रै हुन्छ हामीलाई
आधी मात्रै हुन्छ अनि आधीले त लाइक 1% गेट्स टु भनेपछि त्योभन्दा हाफले मात्रै पाउँछ
त्यही भनेको त्यसैले टाइम लाग्छ अब अहिले भ्याक्सिन आयो भनेर सबै धेरै एक्साइटमेन्ट छ होइन तर
चाहिँ धेरै क्या नट जस्ट फर अस इभन लाइक ल अमेरिकामै भ्याक्सिन अप्रुभ हुन आँट्यो भनेर नेपालमा
त्यही भनेको अब त्यो अब सबैलाई अफकोर्स होप छ तर रियालिटी चाहिँ टाइम लाग्छ त्यो नि त्यो चाहिँ हामीले एकदमै बुझ्नुपर्छ
यो टाइम लाइन चाहिँ यसरी त्यो म्याथमेटिकली क्यालकुलेट गरेर मान्छेहरूले कन्सिभ गर्न हतपत्ती नसक्ने रहेछ कि सुरुमा सुन्दाखेरि युएसको पपुलेसन यति धेरै छ ओ माई गड युएसमा चाहिँ 1 मिलियन केस भयो भन्दाखेरि मान्छे तर्सेको थियो तर 1 in million पपुलेसनमा त बढी थिएन नि त त्यस्तै अब ब्लड पपुलेसन त यति धेरै छ त्यो सोच्दाखेरि चाहिँ इट्स स्टिल सो मच टाइम कि हामी अझै डराएर मास्क लगाएर सोसियल डिस्टेन्स गरेर बस्नुपर्ने चाहिँ
हो त्यो समरसम्म मोस्ट प्रब्ली मास्क लगाएरै बस्नुपर्ने सोसियल डिस्टेन्स गरेरै बस्नुपर्ने नै हुन्छ किनभने मान्छेले भ्याक्सिन पाए पनि भ्याक्सिन पाउन थाल्यो भने पनि मेजोरिटी अफ द पपुलेसनले अझै पाएको हुँदैन अनि त्यसैले त्यो अब हाम्रो रिस्पोन्सिबिलिटी हुन्छ जसले भ्याक्सिन पाउने उनीहरूले पनि मास्क लगाएरै बस्नु पर्यो अरूले पाउनु जान्छ
यो रङ इन्फर्मेसन फ्लो भइरहेको हुँदाखेरि चाहिँ 5th वेभ 6th वेभहरू अरू आउने चान्सेसहरू अझ बढी हुन्छ त्यो टाइममा
त्यही डर छ अब कस्तो भने अब भन्नुहोस् अब हेल्थ केयर वर्करले भ्याक्सिन पायो अनि कोहीले भ्याक्सिन पायो उनीहरूले त्यसपछि मास्क लाउनै छोडेर हिँड्न थाल्यो भने अनि त्यसपछि अरू मान्छेले पनि त्यसरी मास्क लाउन छोडेर हिँडेपछि फेरि अर्को त्यो प्रब्लम भयो अनि फेरि अर्को के छ भने यो भ्याक्सिनको स्टडी गर्दा उनीहरूले के हेरेको छ भने त्यो भ्याक्सिनले डिजिज हुनुबाट जोगाउँछ कि जोगाउँदैन त्यो स्टडी गरेको छ के स्टडी गरेको छैन भने त्यो भ्याक्सिनले ट्रान्समिसन रोक्छ कि रोक्दैन त्यो त स्टडी भएकै छैन भनेपछि मान्छेले भ्याक्सिन पाएपछि उनीहरू बिरामी नहुने तर अरूलाई सार्नु सक्दैन भन्ने त छँदै छैन त्यो चाहिँ स्टडी भएको छैन
कस्तो हिडन इन्फर्मेसन रहेछ के मान्छेलाई दिनुपर्ने बट मोस्ट पिपल दे माइट नट जस्ट नो
अहिले अब चाहिँ मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट अफ कोर्स मान्छेलाई त्यो डिजिजबाट जोगाउने मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट कुरा भयो होइन अनि त्यसैले त्यो फर्स्ट प्रायोरिटी त्यही त्यो स्टडी गर्नलाई अब ट्रान्समिसन हुन्छ कि हुँदैन त्यो चाहिँ उनीहरूले एनालाइज गर्दै हेर्नुपर्छ त्यो पनि अब आउँछ स्टडिज आउँछ तर त्यो चाहिँ अहिले अलिक थाहा छैन
अनि अर्को कुरा है यो के भन्छ भ्याक्सिनको कस्ट कसले रेगुलेट गर्छ त्यसमा केही कुरा थाहा भइसकेको छ अहिलेसम्म
त्यो मलाई त्यो थाहा भएन अब त्यो गभर्मेन्टहरूलाई हुन्छ
गभर्मेन्ट इज गोइङ टु प्रोभाइड फर फ्री अथवा नेपाल इन्डिया जस्तो कन्ट्रीले भ्याक्सिन कसरी पाउँछ होला इफ WHO होइन उनीहरूलाई हेल्प गर्ने हो कि आफैमा कन्ट्रीहरू सिटिजनहरू डिपेन्ड हुने हो कि
त्यो थाहा अब नेपाल जस्तो कन्ट्रिजहरूलाई अलिक गाह्रै हुन्छ त्यो भ्याक्सिनहरू पाउन ढिलो पनि हुन्छ हामीहरूभन्दा ढिलै हुन्छ किनभने त्यहाँ पुगे पनि धेरै डोज पुग्ने होइन त्यहाँ अब कस्टको कुरा पनि आयो फेरि त्यो अब -70 डिग्री सेल्सियसको भ्याक्सिनको इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चर पनि चाहियो त्यो जताततै हुँदैन अब हामीहरू कहीँ यहाँ हाम्रो हस्पिटलमै हुँदैन -70 डिग्रिज त्यो कुनै त्यो रिसर्च फेसिलिटिजमा मात्रै हुन्छ कुनै पनि क्लिनिकल एरियामा हुँदैन त्यो -70 अब त्यसको लागि हस्पिटलहरूले नै बनाउनु पर्यो ठाउँ होइन अब त्यो त्यसै त्यो मेसेन्जर आरएनए भ्याक्सिन नेपालहरू जस्तोको ठाउँलाई अलिक गाह्रै हुन्छ त्यहाँ चाहिँ अब अरू टाइप्स अफ भ्याक्सिन चाहिँ चल्ला जस्तो लाग्छ मेरो विचारमा
थ्याङ्क यू मेरो क्वेसन सक्यो
दाइ धेरै धन्यवाद कस्तो राम्रो कस्तो डिटेल प्रेजेन्टेसन दिनुभयो है भेरी इन्फर्मेटिभ अनि अघि हामी सबैलाई फेरि रिमाइन्ड भयो वी आर सो प्राउड अफ आवर कम्युनिटी सो प्राउड अफ आवर कम्युनिटी मेम्बर्स हुन्छ नि हाम्रो कम्युनिटी कस्तो कस्तो रिसोर्सफुल छ नि है हुन्छ नि आइ एम सो प्राउड अफ आवर नेपाली
Exactly.
So we should all be very proud of our
Yes, no, we have a very good community.
Totally agree, Jamatai.
त्यही त अहिले फिल्ड क्या अब मेडिकल फिल्ड त्यसपछि अरू अरू फिल्डहरूमा पनि एकदमै वेल एकदमै खतरा एकदम मान्छेहरू प्राइड अन द्याट अनि मेरो क्वेसन अघि गीताजीले अघि भनिहाल्नुभयो एकदम मैले चाहिँ अब हेर्नु सबै फ्यामिली मेम्बर मेरो धेरै जस्तो फ्यामिलीमा र अरू धेरैजनाहरू चाहिँ नेपालमै हुनुहुन्छ नेपालकै चिन्ता लाग्छ यहाँ त whatever comes out will get it हुन्छ नि अमेरिकामा मान्छेले पाइहाल्छ नेपालमा चाहिँ अहिले पनि कुरा निस्किहाले भर्खरै होइन कसरी कहिले कति एमाउन्टमा भ्याक्सिन पाउँछ होला भन्ने हुन्छ नि दिमागमा आइरहेको थियो अनि त्यही सम्बन्धी यो कोभ्याक्स अनि गाबी के छ भने हेर्नुहोस् न त्यो तपाईँको डब्लुएचओको यो अलायन्स के अरे कोभ्याक्स त्यसपछि यो गाबी अलायन्स के गर्दैछ कसो हुँदैछ कहाँ छ त्यो हुन्छ नि अब नेपाल जस्तो कन्ट्रीहरू अथवा अफ्रिकन कन्ट्रीहरू भयो अरू पुवर रिसोर्सेस भएको कन्ट्रीहरू के छ यो इक्वेसन
मैले त्यो बारेमा मलाई थाहा भएन भनेपछि तर के भन्छ अब यहाँभन्दा एटलिस्ट 2-3 months बिहाइन्ड चाहिँ हुन्छ किनभने पहिला अब यो वेस्टर्न कन्ट्रिजहरूले अब डेफिनेटली आफ्नो अब युएसएमा भनौँ न मोस्ट केसेस इन द वर्ल्ड युएसएमै छ अहिले अनि युएसएमै भएको कुराहरू उनीहरूले युएसएलाई प्रायोरिटाइज नगरी त्यो अरू ठाउँ पठाउने पनि होइन प्रायोरिटाइज भनेको अल द भ्याक्सिन विल नट स्टे इन द युएस बाहिर पनि जान्छ तर बिग चङ्क अफ द्याट विल स्टे हियर बिगेस्ट प्रब्लम यही नै छ तर त्यसैले गर्दा अब अरू ठाउँहरूमा जानलाई अलिकति टाइम लाग्छ अब डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिजको लागि भनौँ न अब सबै वेस्टर्न कन्ट्रिजबाट मात्रै जाने होइन अब चाइनाबाट रसियाबाट पनि जाला अब त्यहाँको भ्याक्सिनहरूको उनीहरूले पनि भ्याक्सिनहरू डेभलप गरेको छ नि यहाँ जस्तो क्लिनिकल ट्रायल्सहरू यहाँ जस्तो रिगरस क्लिनिकल ट्रायल्सहरू त भएको छैन तर त्यही पनि उनीहरूले मास प्रोडक्सन गर्यो भने अब उनीहरूले पनि पठाउला डेभलपिङ कन्ट्रिजमा होइन त्यसैले यहाँबाट मात्रै जाने होइन तर त्यो टाइम लाग्छ त्यहाँ नि एटलिस्ट 2-3 months अलिक ढिलो हुन्छ त्यहाँ मेरो विचारमा यहाँ जस्तो यो डिसेम्बरमै हुँदैन
हजुर त्यही त यहाँ उयो आई थिङ्क डब्लुएचओले अब तपाईँको आई थिङ्क दे हेभ के कोभ्याक्स अलायन्स सरकारी उनीहरूले यो डेभलपिङ कन्ट्री अनि अरू कन्ट्रीहरू पनि थुप्रै देशहरूको आई थिङ्क दे हेभ डेभलपमेन्ट अनि आई थिङ्क दे इन्भेस्टेड इन मल्टिपल यो फार्मास्युटिकल आई थिङ्क प्रोभाइड द फाइजर अथवा अरूहरूमा पनि गरेको छ क्यारे आई थिङ्क सो द्याट दे क्यान बाई द दे क्यान डिस्ट्रिब्युट आई थिङ्क त्यो हुन्छ नि इक्विटी हुन्छ नि आउने भने त्यस्तो खालको के अलायन्स छ क्यारे होइन मलाई त्यति डिटेल थाहा भएन आई थिङ्क बाई द्याट वे आई थिङ्क नेपाल जस्तो कन्ट्री डेभलप कन्ट्रीले पनि धेरै ढिलो भए पनि तर धेरै ढिलो नपाउँदा जस्तो छ यहाँ अमेरिकामा सबैले पाइसकेर बल्ल नेपालतिर नपाउने
ए होइन होइन त्यस्तो त होइन यहाँ सबैले पाइसकेर पाउने होइन यहाँ त्यहाँ पनि जान्छ भ्याक्सिन अलिक थोरै मात्रामा जान्छ त्यो तर के छ भने अब यिनीहरू भ्याक्सिनहरू बनाउने या कुनै पनि ड्रग बनाउने कम्पनीहरूको हुन्छ उनीहरूको युजुअल कोर्स अफ इभेन्ट्स चाहिँ पहिला एफडिए अप्रुभल हुनु पऱ्यो त्यसपछि उनीहरू इन्डस्ट्रियल स्केल प्रोडक्सन त्यसपछि गर्ने किनभने अप्रुभ नै भएन भने त्यत्रो पैसा वेस्ट गर्ने त्यो उनीहरूलाई हुँदैन नि तर यो सिचुएसनमा चाहिँ के गरेको छ भने उनीहरूलाई पहिला नै ग्यारेन्टी गरेको छ पैसा पाउँछ भनेर वेदर द भ्याक्सिन वर्क्स अर नट त्यसो गर्दा उनीहरूले पहिल्यैदेखि नै इन्डस्ट्रियल स्केल प्रोडक्सन पहिल्यैदेखि नै प्लान गरेर सुरु गरिरहेको हुन्छ त्यो गर्नुलाई पैसा धेरै पठाएको छ गभर्मेन्ट सरले
ल भाउजू नसरा भाउजू I think we should prepare for a big gathering towards the end of summer. I hope. Kinda like.
I wish. Maybe all of us.
अनुहारै बिर्सिन लागिसक्यो भने
At least यति पनि भर्चुअलमा गर्न पाइरहेछ र के भइरहेछ
आइसाजीको एउटा क्वेसन छ यहाँ very curious about the pathophysiology of virus in vaccinated person. Like how does the virus react once a person comes in contact with COVID-19? You know, यो vaccinate गरेको आइडिया चाहिँ के हो भने त्यो मान्छेले एक्चुअल कोभिड भाइरस नदेखि पनि कोभिड भाइरसको प्रोटिन्सहरू देखेको जस्तै गरेर एन्टिबडिज बनाउने त्यो भ्याक्सिनले गर्दा त्यसो गर्दा पछि त्यो मान्छे एक्सपोज टु कोभिड भयो भने त्यो एन्टिबडिजले त्यो भाइरसलाई इनएक्टिभेट गर्ने अनि त्यसो गर्दा त्यो मान्छे बिरामी हुँदैन बेसिक आइडिया त्यो नै हो अलिक क्लियर भयो कि Oh, message about a question, Eric.
Okay, it was from Aisha.
From Aisha.
Okay. Looks is good. Anybody? All questions, sir? Okay, looks like Geeta raise hand.
म भनौँ एउटा क्वेसन यो हाम्रो लास्ट मिटिङमा पनि रेज भएको थियो होइन मलाई फेरि गर्न मन लाग्यो अनि अरूले पनि सुन्नुहोस् के अरे COVID-19 भाइरस चाहिँ लाइक अदर कोरोना भाइरस विल इट समडे डिसअपियर कि हामीसँग लाइक फ्लू जस्तै सधैँभरि बसिरहन्छ डु वी निड टु ह्याभ लाइक बिन भ्याक्सिनेटेड एभ्री इयर फ्लू भ्याक्सिन सँगसँगै कोभिड भ्याक्सिन पनि लाउने भन्ने हुन्छ कि
गुड क्वेसन अब यो चाहिँ भ्याक्सिन आएपछि यो पर्टिकुलर भाइरस जान्छ मोस्ट प्रोबेबली होइन अब खालि त्यसमा म्युटेसन भएर फेऱ्यो भने चाहिँ भिन्दै कुरा हो नभए इन इट्स प्रेजेन्ट फर्म वाइड स्प्रेड भ्याक्सिन त डेफिनेटली हुन्छ अलिक टाइम कुरा मात्रै हो 6 महिना 8 महिना लाग्ला त्यसपछि यो जानुपर्ने तर प्रब्लम के छ भने त्यो म्युटेसन भयो भने अलिकति भिन्दै हुन्छ अनि त्यो म्युटेटेड भाइरसले फेरि डिजिज कज गर्न सक्छ अब त्यो हुन्छ हुँदैन अहिलेसम्म भन्न सकेको छैन जेनरली आरएनए भाइरसहरू चाहिँ अलिक चाँडै म्युटेसन हुन्छ अब यो चाहिँ अहिलेसम्म भएको छैन 1-2 महिना अगाडि त्यो नर्दर्न युरोपमा त्यो मिङ्क्सहरूमा फैलियो भनेर त्यहाँ एन्टायर पपुलेसन अफ मिङ्क्सले डिस्ट्रोय गरेको थियो डेनमार्क कि कुन कन्ट्रीमा अनि त्यतिखेर चाहिँ साह्रै डर लाग्थ्यो नयाँ खालको हो कि भनेर तर त्यसपछि फेरि त्यति सुनिएको छैन त्यसै अहिले चाहिँ भन्न सकिँदैन अब हेरौँ भ्याक्सिन भएपछि के हुन्छ त्यस्तो म्युटेसन भयो भने त्यो फ्लू जस्तै नै हुन्छ फेरि एभ्री इयर दिनुपर्ने खालको हुनसक्छ त्यो भने तर अहिले त्यस्तो लाग्दैन अहिले हेर्दा चाहिँ यत्रो महिना भयो त्यस्तो म्युटेसनहरू त्यति देखेको छैन
अघि आयसाको क्वेसन थियो नि लाइक रिइन्फेक्सन मान्छे
हजुर
भइसकेको इन्फेक्सन इट वाज भेरी रेयर है जब आयसाको क्वेसन आयो नि त्यस्तो केसहरू देख्यो भनेर यस्तोमा केही चान्स छ लाइक इभन अ लिटल चान्स कि म्युटेसन भयो कि भन्ने
हो त्यही हेर्नुपर्ने हुन्छ किनभने यो नयाँ यस्तो भइरहेको छ भने चाहिँ डेफिनेटली वी आर वरिड अबाउट अ म्युटेटेड फर्म अफ द भाइरस किनभने यत्रो महिना हामीले हेरेको छौँ कतिपल्ट आएको छ पेसेन्टलाई फेरि टेस्ट पोजिटिभ आयो पहिला बाहिर टेस्ट भएको थियो उसमा फेरि रिइन्फेक्सन भयो कि भनेर अनि हामी कतिजना मान्छे त्यस्तोमा हामीले त्यसको भाइरल लोड हेऱ्यो कति छ भाइरस भन्दा अनि इच एन्ड एभ्री सिङ्गल केस अमाउन्ट अफ भाइरस इज भेरी भेरी स्मल अनि त्यसले गर्दा त्यो रिइन्फेक्सन होइन मलाई प्रष्टै थाहा थियो किनभने हामीलाई थाहा छ त्यो कति टाइमसम्म त्यो पोजिटिभ हुनसक्छ भनेर तर उहाँले भन्नुभएको जस्तो अब कतिजना पेसेन्ट यसरी आयो 3-4 महिना पछि आएर फेरि उनीहरू बिरामी छ र फेरि पोजिटिभ टेस्ट आयो भनेपछि अलिकति त्यो डराउनु पर्ने एक्ज्याक्टली त्यही नै हो यो म्युटेटेड फर्म हो कि भनेर
अहिले धेरै जस्तो एकदम कमन प्र्याक्टिस नेपालमा धेरै जस्तो देखिएको चाहिँ people who got COVID, उनीहरू चाहिँ ल I got COVID, then I recovered, त्यो kind of like हाम्रो प्रेसिडेन्टको एउटा भोइस थियो नि, म चाहिँ कोरोना भाइरससँग इम्युन भयो भनेर, त्यो खालको एटिट्युड अलिकति मान्छेहरूमा देखिएको जस्तो लाग्छ कि
त्यो अब अनफोर्चुनेटली उनीहरूले भनेको त इन अ वे करेक्ट हो, त्यो उनीहरू दे आर इम्युन, तर त्यो बिहेभियर चाहिँ अलिक ठिक भएन, किन अब सोसाइटीमा अलिकति रेस्पोन्सिबिलिटी हुनु पऱ्यो नि, आफूलाई लागेन भनेपछि अरूको बारेमा नसोच्ने कुरा त भएन।
टेक्निकली करेक्ट बट मोरली रङ डिसिजन
हो एक्ज्याक्टली त्यो। अब नेपालमा पनि अर्को कुरा के छ भने कतिजना सुनेको छौँ कस्तो अनि त्यो पेसेन्टहरूलाई फेरि रिइन्फेक्सन भयो भनेर कति सुनिएको छ त्यहाँ नि, तर त्यहाँ अनफोर्चुनेटली के छ भने त्यो टेस्टिङ क्वालिटी अलिक ठिक छैन त्यहाँ, अनि त्यसैले एक्ज्याक्टली भन्नु अलिक गाह्रो छ त्यहाँको नि। अब कति पहिला कति फल्स पोजिटिभ्स आएको छ त्यहाँ। पिसिआर भनेको एक्चुली पहिला कहिले नगरेको मान्छेले पिसिआर गर्न थालेपछि त्यसरी त्यस्तो सजिलो खालको टेस्ट होइन, अलिक सोफिस्टिकेटेड खालको टेस्ट नै हो। अनि त्यहाँ नेपालमा पहिला कुनै पोजिटिभ चाहिँ प्रब्लली फल्स पोजिटिभ्सहरू पनि हुनसक्छ।
We have one question from Aisha again.
CDC recently discovered about the antibody during mid-December 2000. What do you think about this as well? उहाँले के सोध्नु भने CDCले recently उनीहरूले antigen test and discovered about the antibody. मैले अलिकति बुझिनँ हो आइसिजी क्वेसन।
लाइक कोरोना युएसमा आएको भन्दा पहिले नै एन्टिबडी थियो भनेको
about the new antibody exactly mid-December 2019. Yes, that is almost certainly correct. किनभने चाइनाले डिसेम्बरमा उनीहरूलाई मजाले थाहा थियो यो एपिडेमिक भइरहेको छ भनेर, उनीहरूले लुकाइरहेको थियो। उनीहरूले डेफिनेटली त्यो उनीहरूलाई मजाले थाहा थियो यो बिग प्रब्लम हुन्छ भनेर, अनि उनीहरूले अनाउन्स गरेको थियो। डिसेम्बर 31 मात्रै अनाउन्स गरेको थियो। अब लास्ट डे एक्चुली हामी डिसेम्बरमा हामी भेकेसनमा थियौँ हाम्रो फ्यामिली नि, अनि हामीले न्युजमा त्यो हेर्दै थियौँ चाइनामा यस्तो भइरहेको छ भनेर, अनि मैले त्यतिखेरै भनिरहेको थिएँ नानीहरूलाई यो चाहिँ दिस इज गोइङ टु बी अ प्रब्लम भनेर, अनि उनीहरूले त्यो अनाउन्स गरेकै थिएन। डेफिनेटली नोभेम्बरमा त्यहाँ केसेस फैलिरहेकै थियो वुहानमा, पोसिबली ब्याक इन अक्टोबर पोसिबली ब्याक इन सेप्टेम्बर पनि फैलिरहेको थियो त्यहाँ। अब यहाँ हामीले युएसएमा फर्स्ट डिटेक्टेड केस जनवरी 21 भयो, तर त्योभन्दा अगाडि मैले नै एउटा पेसेन्ट देखेको थिएँ, पोसिबली उसको कोरोना भाइरस थियो त्योभन्दा अगाडि नै, त्यतिखेर थाहा थिएन सिम्पटम्स, अहिले पछि सोच्दा एक्ज्याक्टली त्यस्तै नै थियो। अनि यहाँ डिसेम्बरमा थियो भने त एकदमै भेरी भेरी पोसिबल, किनभने युएसए र चाइना द भेरी वेल कनेक्टेड, ट्राभल ब्याक इन द बिजनेस ट्राभल कति भइरहन्छ। त्यहाँ अक्टोबर डेफिनेटली नोभेम्बरमा फैलिरहेको थियो भने डेफिनेटली त्यहाँ कुनै अमेरिकन इन्फेक्टेड भएर यता आएको हुनसक्छ। अनि फेरि अब जनवरीमा यहाँ थाहा भएको पनि उनीहरूले स्पेसली कोरोना भाइरसलाई टेस्ट गरेर थाहा भएको पनि होइन, त्यो वासिङटन स्टेटमा त्यो अरू स्टडीको लागि इन्फ्लुएन्जा के स्टडीको लागि ब्लड स्पेसिमेनहरू उनीहरूले प्रिजर्भ गरेर राखेकोमा कुनै रिसर्चरले अगेन्स्ट दि अथोरिटिज गएर एक्चुली टेस्ट गरेर थाहा पाएको हो, किनभने त्यहाँ टेस्ट नगर्नु भन्ने खालको त्यो थियो त्यतिखेर नै। त्यसैले त्योभन्दा अगाडि नै डेफिनेटली थियो, अनि मिड डिसेम्बरमा अलमोस्ट सर्टली यहाँ थियो त्यतिखेर।
Yeah, they had to do a big party, right?
Oh.
They had to go against the FDA.
Exactly.
Break the protocol, it's not protocol breakdown, right? It was a big fight.
Oh, it was a big fight. अनि त्यतिखेर उनीहरू थाहा पायो त्योभन्दा अगाडि नै थियो वासिङटन स्टेटमा।
रेट्रोस्पेक्टिभ स्टडी गर्दाखेरि यो हुँदै त्यति इम्पोर्टेन्ट छैन, त्यही पनि मेरो क्युरियोसिटीको लागि रेट्रोस्पेक्टिभ स्टडी गर्दाखेरि तिनीहरूले त्यो कसरी त्यो किनभने हामी कोरोना भाइरस हामी पहिला पनि हाम्रो रेस्पिरेटरी भाइरल प्यानलमा हामीसँग पहिला पनि थियो नि कोरोना भाइरसहरू, त्यो त एउटा फ्यामिली भयो, तर यो कसरी म्युटेसन भयो र यो कसरी त्यो भयो, तिनीहरूले कुन चाहिँ भेक्टरबाट भयो त्यो कुनै पत्ता लाग्यो, त्यतातिर त्यो नि त्यो ब्याटको यस्तो यस्तो सबै त्यो अहिले केही गर्यो तिनीहरूले त्यो स्टडी अलिक डिटेलमा।
त्यो मैले एक्चुली त्यति डिटेलमा मैले त्यो हेरेको छुइनँ। अब पहिला भएको कोरोना भाइरसेसहरू त त्यो कमनली सर्कुलेटिङ कोरोना भाइरस हाम्रो जुन टेस्टहरूमा आउँछ मल्टिप्लेक्स प्यानलहरूमा, तिनीहरू भिन्दैको यो अलिक भिन्दै खालको कोरोना भाइरस हो। यो प्रब्लली कुन एनिमलबाटै आएको हुनुपर्छ, किनभने जेनरली यस्तो भाइरसेस आउँदा कुन एनिमल बाट ट्रान्समिट हुन्छ ह्युमन्समा नि अलिअलि ट्रान्समिसन त अरू भाइरसेसहरूको पनि भइरहेकै हुन्छ तर कस्तो हुन्छ भने एनिमल भाइरसेसहरू ह्युमन्समा आएपछि उनीहरूको त्यो ट्रान्समिसन एफिकेसी त्यति राम्रो हुँदैन त्यसमा आयो 3-4जना 5-6जनालाई इन्फेक्ट हुन्छ त्यतिकै सकेर जान्छ कुनै कुनै चाहिँ ह्युमन्समा आएर पनि ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन हुन सक्यो भने अनि तिनीहरू फैलिने हो अनि त्यस्तै के भएको हुनुपर्छ यसमा कुनै एनिमलबाट ह्युमनमा आयो वेल एड्याप्टेड अनि ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन हुन सक्यो यसको
मैले कतै पढेको थिएँ होइन दिस इज अ वान टाइम सिङ्गल इभेन्ट भनेर मैले जमानामा पढेको थिएँ होइन हुन्छ नि जस्ट वान भाइरस हुन्छ नि वाज एबल टु डेभलप म्युटेसन एन्ड हुन्छ नि गो टु द फ्रम द एनिमल टु ह्युमन होइन त्यो मोस्ट लाइकली त्यही नै हो दाइ गर्नुहुन्छ होइन जस्ट वान
होइन त्यो एनिमल टु ह्युमन त मच मोर फ्रिक्वेन्टली भइरहेको हुनुपर्छ एनिमल टु ह्युमन भएको पनि तर कस्तो भने एनिमल टु ह्युमन भयो अनि ह्युमन्समै सक्यो ह्युमन टु अर्को ह्युमनमा जानु सकेन त्यसैले कतिवटा कुरा त्यतिमै सकिन्छ तर कहिले त्यस्तै सर्कमस्टान्सेस भएर एनिमल टु ह्युमन भयो त्यही चिज अब ह्युमन टु ह्युमन जानु सक्यो भने अनि फैलिन्छ अनि ह्युमन टु ह्युमन पनि त्यो ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन पनि इनएफिसियन्ट भयो भने धेरै फैलिँदैन अलिअलि फैलिन्छ अनि बिस्तारै डाइ आउट गर्छ तर एफिसियन्ट ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन हुन सक्यो अनि फैलिन्छ यसरी
मैले के भन्नु इज इट वान भाइरस हुन्छ नि वान सिङ्गल भाइरस द्याट
अब यो हाम्रो इन्फ्लुएन्जा भाइरसेसहरू त्यही जेनरली एनिमलबाटै आउँछ कि त पिग्सबाट कि बर्ड्सबाट आउने हो अनि आइरहेको छ बिचबिचमा अनि तिनीहरू अब एभियन इन्फ्लुएन्जा भन्ने सुनिन्छ बेला बेलामा स्वाइन इन्फ्लुएन्जा तिनीहरू पिग्सबाट त्यो बर्ड्सबाटै आउने हो तर त्यति धेरै अलिअलि ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन पनि हुन्छ धेरै हुँदैन कहिले अब यो कोरोना भाइरस पहिलाको सार्स पनि त्यसरी नै भएको हो त्यो पनि आएर एक्चुली क्वाइट एफिसियन्ट ह्युमन टु ह्युमन ट्रान्समिसन भएको थियो त्यसमा तर त्यसमा चाहिँ एडभान्टेज के थियो भने एसिम्टोमेटिक पेसेन्टबाट ट्रान्समिसन नहुने किनभने मान्छे सिम्टम्स आइसकेपछि 3-4 दिनपछि मात्रै उनीहरू इन्फेक्सियस हुने यसमा चाहिँ के भयो भने 3-4 दिनपछि होइन सिम्टम्स नहुँदै उनीहरू इन्फेक्सियस हुने त्यसले गर्दा यो धेरै फैलिन सक्यो तर एभ्री 10 years मेबी 10-15 yearsमा यस्तो आउँछ भनेर हामीले एक्सपेक्ट गर्नै पऱ्यो नि अब हेर्नुहोस् न कोरोना भाइरसकै अब फ्लू त आइरहेकै हुन्छ होइन कोरोना भाइरसकै अब 2003मा एउटा आयो त्यसपछि 2012मा अर्को आयो अहिले 2019मा अर्को आयो अब यो आउँछ भनेर एक्सपेक्ट गर्नै पर्छ नि
हेर्नु दाइ त्यही त अब द जिनियस अफ दिस भाइरस हेर्नु दाइ इट डजन्ट किल एभ्रीबडी इट किल्स भेरी भेरी फ्यु पिपल हैन द्याट्स द एडभान्टेज but it spreads so easily and so widely है हुन्छ नि हेर्नु न अब पर्सन थियो which was very very lethal compared to this one हुन्छ नि it didn't spread up that's the के अरे तपाईँको यो के भन्छ तपाईँको यो तपाईँको के अरे यो इभोल्युसन हुन्छ नि इट्स एडभान्टेज हुन्छ नि अब तपाईँको this virus हुन्छ नि अब it's killed so many people हुन्छ नि
अब यसको अझै यो यसको अब एयरबोर्न इफेक्टिभ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन भएको भए त धेरै डर लाग्दो हुन्थ्यो अब यो एयरबोर्न त मिनिमम हो किनभने एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन भयो भने हाउस होल्ड कन्ट्याक्ट्सको 90% 95%लाई भइहाल्छ कसरी रोक्नु होइन एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन अब यो एयरबोर्न होइन त्यसैले हाउस होल्ड कन्ट्याक्ट्समा त्यो धेरै हुँदैन यसमा मास्क लाउनु धेरै जोगिन्छ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन भएको मास्क लाएर पनि त्यो धेरै रोकिँदैन त्यो
पेसेन्टहरू तपाईँले फलोअपमा हेरिरहनु भएको हुँदाखेरि तपाईँले जस्तै सबैजनाको जानकारीको लागि कस्तो खाले सिम्टम्सहरू तपाईँले जस्तै रिकभर भइसकेपछि पनि अब उनीहरूको सिक्वेलेमा अब अलिकति थोरै सिम्टम्सहरू होला जस्तै फटिग होइन मैले मोस्टली थाहा पाएको भनेको फटिग हो अरू केही छ तपाईँको एक्सपिरियन्समा
हामीहरूका पनि त्यति आउँदैन किन अब त्यति पोस्ट इन्फेक्सन भइसक्यो भाइरस लङ गइसकेको हुन्छ होइन युजुअली चाहिँ उनीहरू जाने भनेको अब त्यही जुन सिस्टम एफेक्टेड छ त्यतातिर जान्छ फलोअपको लागि हामीहरूका आयो भने मेनली त्यही तिम्रो जस्तो फटिगको लागि आउँछ हामीले कहिलेकाहीँ हेर्छौँ फटिगको लागि तर अरू चाहिँ अब प्रोलङ्ड रेस्पिरेटरी सिम्टम्स भयो भने उनीहरू चाहिँ पल्मोनोलोजीका फलोअप गराएको हुन्छ कोही कोहीलाई अटोनोमिक इन्स्टेबिलिटी भएर उनीहरूको ट्याकिकार्डिया अर्थोस्ट्याटिक हाइपरटेन्सन त्यस्तो हुने उनीहरू कार्डियोलोजीका गइरहेको हुन्छ त्यही हो तर जहाँ गए पनि त्यसको अब इफेक्टिभ ट्रिटमेन्ट भने त के नै छैन नि अहिले किन हामीलाई थाहै छैन के कारणले भएको त्यो अलिक टाइम दिनुपर्ने पर्खिनुपर्ने हो
किनभने हामीले रिसेन्टली त हामीहरूको जस्तो फ्लोरिडामा भयो न्युयोर्कमा भयो बच्चाहरूमा स्पेसली कावासाकी जस्तो मल्टी इन्फ्लामेटरी मल्टी सिस्टम इन्फ्लामेटरी डिसअर्डरहरू देखिरहेको थियो होइन
तर त्यो मल्टी सिस्टम त्यो त अब अक्युट इलनेस भयो होइन तर उनीहरूलाई लङ टर्म के होला रिकभरीमा होइन त्यो गाह्रो छ के गर्ने भने त्यस्तो भयो भने चाहिँ भन्नुहोस् अशोक
सार्ने चाहिँ रेट कम छ भने जस्तो सुनेको त्यो के साँचो हो
त्यो साँचो नै हो यसको त्यो यहाँ कस्तो हुन्छ नि त्यो रिप्रोडक्टिभ नम्बर भन्ने हुन्छ नि त्यो चाहिँ कमै छ यसको अनि त्यसैले अब एउटा पेसेन्टबाट अन एन एभरेज मेबी दुईजना अरूलाई सर्ने हो त्यो चाहिँ यो इन्फेक्सन डिजिज एपिडेमियोलोजीमा कमै हो त्यो चाहिँ भेरी कन्सिस्टेन्ट विथ ड्रपलेट स्प्रेड इन्फेक्सन हुन्छ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसन भएको डिजिजहरूमा त्यो नम्बर 12 to 18 जस्तो 12, 15, 18 त्यति हाई हुन्छ एउटा इन्फेक्टेड पेसेन्टबाट 12जना 15जना 18जना इन्फेक्ट हुने यसमा चाहिँ एउटा इन्फेक्टेड पेसेन्टबाट 2जना जति इन्फेक्ट हुने त्यस्तो कमै हो तर डेफिनेटली मोर देन इन्फ्लुएन्जाहरू भयो उनीहरूमा 1.2 1.3 त्यस्तै हुन्छ यो चाहिँ ज्यादा भयो तर अब त्यो चाहिँ अब इन द एब्सेन्स अफ एनिथिङ एल्स अब मास्कहरू लायो कन्सिस्टेन्ट लायो भने त्यो त धेरै कम भइहाल्छ होइन बच्चाहरू बुझ्ने बच्चाहरू ठिकै हुन्छ सानो बच्चाहरू चाहिँ गाह्रो छ उनीहरूले मास्क लगाएर जानु भनेपछि पनि अब गएर के गर्ने हो थाहा छैन नि त्यही त बच्चाहरूलाई चाहिँ धेरै गाह्रो छ त्यो भिजिटेसन पोलिसीहरूमा चेन्ज आउनु नि अलिकति टाइम नै लाग्छ किनभने अब हस्पिटलहरू नर्सिङ होमहरू उनीहरू रिस्क लिँदैन यस्तो कुरामा नि अनफर्चुनेटली अब अलिक टाइमै लाग्छ होला त्यो कम्युनिटीमा ट्रान्समिसन कम हुनुजेल उनीहरूको पोलिसी त्यति चेन्ज गर्ला जस्तो लाग्दैन खास भन्नु छ भने अब कुनै थट लिडर्सहरू हुन्छ नि उनीहरूले जे पोलिसी बनाउँछ अरू सबैले त्यही फलो गर्ने हो एउटाले गरेपछि अब सुरुमा भनौँ न त्यो हामीलाई थाहा छ त्यो इन्फेक्टेड हेल्थ केयर पर्सनलाई कति दिनपछि काममा फर्केर आउनु भने कसैले बनाएको थिएन पोलिसी यति भनेर नि अनि हामीले क्लिनिकमा 10 days भनेपछि त्यसपछि सबैले बनाउन थाल्यो त्यसरी अनि त्यो अब एकजनाले भन्नु पर्यो हामी यसो गर्छौँ भनेर अनि अरूले त्यही फलो गर्छ
एउटा कुरा चाहिँ फेरि अहिले यो उसले चाहिँ के रिमाइन्ड गर्यो भन्दाखेरि अहिले कोभिड सिचुएसनले होइन सोसाइटीहरू वी मेक द रुल्स बेस्ड अन आवर निड्स एन्ड बेस्ड अन आवर रिसोर्सेस क्या पहिला यो बिरामी सुरुमा आउँदाखेरि होइन ओ यु हेभ पुट इन द नेगेटिभ प्रेसर रुम सुरुमा आउँदाखेरि हुन्छ नि अब कति हुन्छ र हस्पिटलमा हुन्छ नि अब हुँदा पछि त पोजिटिभ छ भने पनि मास्क लगाएर आयो मान्छे नभएको
होइन त्यही भनेको अब साइन्सले गर्यो भने हामी सुरुमै कोही त्यो हाम्रो त्यो कति फाइट पऱ्यो त्यो नेगेटिभ प्रेसर चाहिँदैन यो ड्रप एभ्रिथिङ पोइन्ट्स टु दिस बिङ अ ड्रपलेट ट्रान्समिसन त्यो वेयर मास्क किप अ डिस्टेन्स अफ 3 to 6 feet सुरुदेखि नै त्यो भएको होइन अब अल्टिमेटली रिसोर्सेस कम हुँदै भएपछि घुमेर त्यसमै फर्केर आइसक्यो होइन सुरुमा आउँदा अब मान्छेलाई धेरै डर पनि थियो अब के भन्ने नयाँ आइरहेको छ भनेर धेरै डर पनि थियो धेरै इरेसनल डिसिसन्स पनि भएको थियो त्यतिखेर तर मुख्य कुरो यसमा चाहिँ नि मास्क यो ड्रपलेट ट्रान्समिसन मास्क लगायो भने धेरै 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 कम हुन्छ ट्रान्समिसन बोथ पिपल अब इफेक्टिभली दुवैजनाले इन्फेक्टेड कुनै पनि मान्छे इन्फेक्टेड छ र अर्को मान्छे त्योसँगै छ दुवैजनाले मास्क लाग्छ भने हामीले त्यसलाई एक्सपोजर काउन्टै गर्दैनौँ
त्यो पनि हुँदैन दाइ हुन्छ नि जानेर होस् कि नजानेर होस् मान्छेले हुन्छ नि
अब त्यो कति मास्क लगाएको भनेको हुन्छ यहाँ पछि त्यो नाक पनि छोपेको हुँदैन मुख पनि छोपेको हुँदैन है तल चिनमा झुन्डाइरहेको हुन्छ
मैले नेपालमा है मेरो दिदी ब्याङ्कमा काम गर्नुहुन्छ अनि कस्टमरहरूलाई देखाएर बस्दा मास्क लगाएर आउनुपर्छ भनेर अनि मास्क लगाएर मान्छे आउने अनि बोल्नु पर्दाखेरि मास्क खोलेर बोल्ने
यहाँ पनि कति ठाउँ त्यो देखेको छु मास्क लगाएको हुन्छ बोल्नु पर्यो भने चाहिँ मास्क खोलेर बोल्ने जुन बेला लाउनु पर्ने त्यतिखेर खोलिरहेको हुन्छ
एकदम गाह्रो छ क्या दाइ यो तपाईँको यो हाम्रो यो इट गोज अगेन्स्ट आवर ह्युमन नेचर नजिक बसेर गफ गर्नुपर्ने होइन है टाँसिएर पुरा हाँसेर होइन गफ गर्नुपर्ने पुरा एक्सप्रेसन देखाएर भाइरल त्यसरी ट्रान्समिट हुन्छ होइन यु हेभ टु गो अगेन्स्ट द्याट नेचुरल
अनि त्यही अब ह्युमन इन्स्टिङ्स भनेको पनि कतिजनाले मास्क लगाएको कारण चाहिँ उनीहरूलाई जोगाउँछ भनेर लगाइरहेको हुन्छ मोर इम्पोर्टेन्ट उनीहरूलाई जोगाउने त अलिअलि जोगाउँछ डिरेक्ट ड्रपलेट्सबाट जोगाउने बट मच मोर इम्पोर्टेन्ट चाहिँ आफू त्यो एसिम्टोमेटिकली इन्फेक्टेड छ भने अरूलाई जोगाउँछ भने मास्कको मुख्य काम चाहिँ त्यो गर्ने तर त्यो सुनायो भने कतिले लाउँदैन पनि होला मास्क त्यो उनीहरूलाई आफैले जोगाउँछ भनेर सोचेकै राम्रो
इट्स सो हार्ड बुझाउने क्या तपाईँको एसिम्टोमेटिक मान्छे होइनले मजाले सार्न सक्छ अथवा हुन्छ नि
प्रिसिम्टोमेटिक एक्ज्याक्टली
बुझाउन यति धेरै गाह्रो छ होइन मलाई सिम्टम भएको छैन हुन्छ नि अनि के गरे पनि हुन्छ भने आज हुन्छ नि त्यो सिपिङ हुनै गाह्रो छ क्या हुन्छ नि हामीलाई पनि गाह्रो हुन्छ होइन
त्यही भनेको सधैँ मास्क लगाउनु पर्ने भनेको त्यही कारणले हो अब प्रिसिम्टोमेटिक को हुन्छ त्यो कसले भन्नै सक्दैन नि सिम्टम्स आउनु चाहिँ
मेरो क्वेसन है लास्ट मास्क त भयो अनि मैले सुनको आँखाहरूबाट पनि जान सक्छ भन्ने सुनेको थिएँ त्यो पक्का हो साँचो हो कि
आँखाको पनि अब त्यो कस्तो भने अब इन्फेक्सियस ड्रपलेट जुन हुन्छ नि त्यो आँखामा झऱ्यो भने त्यसबाट पनि सर्न सक्छ त्यो पनि हो अब त्यसैले अब इन्फेक्टेड मान्छेले मास्क लगाइरहेको छ भने त्यो ड्रपलेट्स कहीँ पनि जाँदैन तर इन्फेक्सन भएको मान्छेले मास्क लगाएको छैन भने उसको ड्रपलेट्स अरू ठाउँ पनि बस्छ त्यो आँखाहरूमा पर्न सक्छ त्यस्तै अब 6 फिटको डिस्टेन्स छ भने त्यो पर्दैन पर्ने चान्स धेरै कम छ मास्क लगाएको छैन भने पनि 6 फिटको डिस्टेन्स टाढो छ भने अब त्यहाँबाट खोके हाँची गऱ्यो भने चाहिँ त्योभन्दा टाढो पनि पुग्न सक्छ नभए बोल्दा ओर्दा 6 फिटसम्म म्युकस मेम्ब्रेन त्यो आँखामा पर्दैन अनि अर्को कुरा चाहिँ अब कुनै मान्छे इन्फेक्सन भएको मान्छे बोलेपछि त्यो ड्रपलेट्सहरू भन्नुहोस् न टेबलमा झऱ्यो या ढोकाको नबमा झऱ्यो अनि त्यो अर्को मान्छेले गएर त्यसमा छुयो अनि त्यही हातले खायो भने त्यसबाट पनि सर्न सक्छ होइन त्यसैले अब हामी चाहिँ के छ भने अब त्यो बेला बेला स्पेसली बाहिर जाँदा बेला बेलामा अब आफ्नो ह्यान्ड सेनिटाइजरलाई नै हात धुने त्यही कारणले हो बाहिरबाट घर आउने बित्तिकै हात धुने कारण त्यही नै हो। अब हातमा के बोकेर आएको छ नि त्यो सफा गर्ने।
Thank you.
पनि अब
कसोको भोलि आयो
भन्छ
अड्किरहेको छ अशोकजी, सुनेको छैन।
अलि अड्केर आएको छ अशोक।
क्वालिटी अनि मार्क कसरी लगाउने भन्ने पनि धेरै डिस्कसन्स छ।
फेरि भन्नुहोस् त। अड्किरहेको छ है।
ओके अशोक।
अशोक सुनिए न अशोक। क्वेसन बुझ्नु हो? मैले बुझिनँ उहाँको।
He is typing right.
ए
Let me see.
Typing here, generation.
मास्क लट अफ क्वेसन अन मास्क क्वालिटी हो होइन? त्यो त्यसको पनि धेरै डिस्कसन भएको छ, कस्तो खालको N95 मास्क लाउने हो कि कस्तो मास्क लाउने हो। बेसिकली यसको लागि यो ड्रपलेट ट्रान्समिसन भएकोले हामीलाई खालि एउटा ब्यारियर प्रोटेक्सन चाहियो, अनि त्यसैले कुनै खालको मास्क भए पनि त्यो धेरै प्रोटेक्ट गर्छ होइन। यो त्यो खालको मास्क गरिरहनु पर्दैन। N95 मास्क भनेको चाहिँ त्यो चाहिँ एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसनबाट प्रोटेक्ट गर्नुलाई मात्रै चाहिने हो त्यो N95 मास्क। त्यो यसको लागि जेनरली चाहिँदैन। अब हस्पिटलहरूमा कुनै प्रोसिजर गर्दा हामी त्यसलाई त्यो एरोसोल जेनेरेटिङ प्रोसिजरहरू भन्छौँ। अब सक्सन गर्दा पोजिटिभ प्रेसर त्यो प्रोसिजरहरू गर्दा त्यतिखेर धेरै एरोसोल जेनेरेट हुनसक्छ। त्यस्तो बेलामा चाहिँ N95 मास्क प्रोटेक्सन चाहिन्छ, अरू बेला चाहिँदैन। अब फेरि अर्को कुरा, अब त्यो क्लथ मास्क चलाउने हो कि सर्जिकल मास्क चलाउने हो, त्यसमा पनि खास धेरै फरक पर्दैन। हस्पिटलहरूले पहिला क्लथ मास्क चलाउनु भनेर सबैलाई भनेको थियो, त्यसपछि सर्जिकल मास्क चलाउनु भनेर अहिले रेकमेन्डेसन छ। त्यसको खालि के भयो भने क्लथ मास्क काम लाग्दैन भनेर होइन, त्यो चाहिँ पहिला स्टडिजहरू गर्दा सर्जिकल मास्कले प्रोटेक्ट गरेको छ भनेर स्टडिजहरू भएको छ। अनि अब अहिले सर्जिकल मास्कको कमी नभएकोले हस्पिटल एम्प्लोइजहरू सबैलाई त्यही कारणले उनीहरूले सर्जिकल मास्क दिएको हो। क्लथ मास्कले प्रोटेक्ट गर्दैन भन्ने छैन। अनि त्यही कारणले अब जुनै पनि ब्यारियर भइहाल्छ, मान्छेले जेसुकै भनोस्, जुनै पनि ब्यारियर भए चलिहाल्छ।
Was very good. Yeah. Thank you, Ashok. Anybody wanna go? Any more questions? Any more questions?
प्रियङ्काको थियो
Sorry.
प्रियङ्का you ask.
That was the question. Okay, so looks like the questions have been your possession पनि. So
आइसाजी तपाईँको क्वेसन थियो नि त्यो क्लिभल्यान्ड डिपार्टमेन्ट अफ पब्लिक हेल्थको, मलाई कन्ट्याक्ट गर्नुहोस् न है। मेरो इमेल एड्रेस म यहाँ टाइप गरेर पठाइदिन्छु है तपाईँलाई।
Someone really
मलाई एउटा एकजना एउटा टेक्स्ट आएको छ यो क्वेसनको लागि, हाउ लङ क्यान वी रियुज द मास्क?
गुड क्वेसन। त्यो त म साँच्चै भन्न सक्दिनँ त्यो नि। त्यो हामी अब कस्तो भने जेनरली अब हस्पिटलमा सर्जिकल मास्कहरू जुन चलाइरहेको हुन्छौँ त्यो सोइल भएन भने फर अ डे युज गराएको छौँ। होइन अब सोइल भयो भने त फेर्ने हो नभए डे युज गराएको छौँ अब क्लथ मास्कहरू त्यही अनुसार घरमा गएर अब रेगुलरली धुने हो आफूलाई जति कम्फर्टेबल लाग्छ तर for one day it should be good if it's not soiled हजुर
What do you mean by soil?
होइन अब त्यो भिज्यो भने त्यो धेरै त्यो थुकहरू धेरै लाग्यो भने त्यसरी आफ्नै अर्काको लागि भने त झन् गर्नै पर्यो होइन तर आफ्नै लागि हजुर
यो N95 मास्कको इलेक्ट्रोस्ट्याटिक प्रपर्टीले पनि रोक्छ होइन त सर्जिकल मास्क पनि त्यस्तो हुन्छ कि N95 मात्रै हो
त्यो मेनली N95 को प्रपर्टी
सर्जिकल मास्कमा त त्यो चाहिँ त्यो मटेरियलमा चाहिँ
त्यो सर्जिकल मास्क त्यो मलाई त्यति थाहा भएन होइन तर सर्जिकल मास्कको मेन थिङ चाहिँ त्यो ड्रपलेटबाटै जोगाउने हो त्यो एयरबोर्न प्रोटेक्सन हुँदैन सर्जिकल मास्कले नि एयरबोर्न ट्रान्समिसनको प्रोटेक्सन हुँदैन
यो मास्क टेस्ट गर्ने टाइमको सुनेको चाहिँ नि मास्क लगाएर अनि क्यान्डल अगाडि राखेर पुग्नु रे होइन यदि क्यान्डल निभ्यो भने त्यो काम लाग्दैन रे यदि क्यान्डल निभ्यो भने चाहिँ
ठिकै ओके द्याट्स फाइन तर क्यान्डल निभ्यो भने पनि नि त्यो मास्कले ड्रपलेट्सहरू त कति रोकिराखेकै हुन्छ क्यान्डल निभ्यो भने पनि त्यो अब त्यस्तो के देखाउँछ नि हावा पास गर्यो भनेर तर त्यही पनि केही मास्क नलाउनु भन्दा त्यो मास्कले पनि ड्रपलेट्सहरू त कति रोकिराखेकै हुन्छ फिजिकली द्याट साउन्ड्स लाइक अ गुड टेस्ट होइन
क्यान्डल टेस्ट इज भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टिङ किनभने कतिपय ग्यास स्टेसनमा वान टाइम युज मास्कहरू जुन बेच्न राखेको थियो नि दोज मास्क एक्चुअली फेल क्यान्डल टेस्ट
Okay.
That's so contradictory to what we're talking about right now, right?
Yes.
They say cloth mask is good for particulates and then you're like barrier matters I'm like the barriers I go here. The particulate barriers whether it is like a piece of cloth or like a mask that you can blow the candle on, it really doesn't matter.
अनि फेरि होइन कस्तो भने नि अब रिस्क भनेको अब 0% या 100% को कुरामा हामी सोच्नु नहुने त्यो इट्स अ कन्टिन्युस स्केल भयो लार्जेस्ट ड्रपलेट्स जुन सबभन्दा धेरै इन्फेक्सियस पार्टिकल्स लार्जेस्ट ड्रपलेट्स हो नि जस्तो मास्क लगाए पनि लार्जेस्ट ड्रपलेट्सलाई त त्यस रोकिहाल्छ त्यो सानो ड्रपलेट्स अब मिडल साइज ड्रपलेट्स पनि अब रिजनेबल मास्कले रोकिहाल्छ अनि त्यसैले एटलिस्ट कुनै मास्क लगाए पनि त्यसले सम अमाउन्ट अफ प्रोटेक्सन भइहाल्छ एक्चुअली प्रिटी गुड अमाउन्ट अफ प्रोटेक्सन हुनुपर्ने
Thank you. Nabin, like as the conversation is kind of moving on, one of the things that I'm thinking about is schools are doing a really good job, keeping it open. We have 5 or 6 counties that are in purple where we live right now. Are you seeing any spread towards activities for kids these days? So just given that we're kind of in purple right now, but the governor hasn't stopped the sporting activities for kids, are you seeing any through that activity?
Any talk about stopping sporting activities?
Now, are you seeing any sort of spread through the sporting activities for kids?
मलाई त्यो क्लियरली थाहा भएन पूजाजी त्यो नि अब डेफिनेटली न्युजमा त आएको छैन त्यसरी स्प्रेड भएको भनेर फ्रम चिल्ड्रेन अब त्यो एनएफएलहरूको त भिन्दै कुरा हो तर स्कुल चिल्ड्रेनहरूको चाहिँ त्यति सुनिएको छैन स्प्रेड त्यो स्पोर्ट्स एक्टिभिटी स्प्रेड भएको नि तर स्प्रेड भएको छैन भनेर डेफिनेटली भन्छ अब साँच्चै भन्नु भने अब हाम्रो स्कुलहरूमा पनि त्यो यिनीहरूको फुटबलहरू पनि चलिरहेको थियो त्यस्तो कन्ट्याक्ट स्पोर्ट्सहरू पनि त्यो त अलिक डेन्जरस नै भयो नि यो कुरामा तर गरिरहेकै थियो गर्नु चाहिँ
wrestling चलिरहेको छ
त्यही त तिनीहरू त राम्रो होइन मेरो विचारमा नि इट डज नट मेक सेन्स
Yeah, that's scary. But no, I was just curious. Thank you.
Classroom activities they're much safer than those types of activities. Classमा जानु नि
Okay, thank you, Pooja, for your questions.